Is 6 p.m. on February 11th, 2025, and I'll call this Lacey City Council work session to order. All council is present. I also want to acknowledge that we, the City of Lacey, are on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Squaw Indian tribe and the Squax Indian tribe. With that, can I get a motion to approve this evening's agenda?
Move to approve the agenda as published.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Then that motion unanimously carries. We have an approved agenda. Next up is public comment. We didn't receive any prior public comments, written or otherwise. Is there anyone here wishing to address the council? Seeing none. Before we go into our main agenda, which is our City Council Planning Commission Comprehensive Plan Update, and thank you, Planning Commission, for being here. Let's go around and do some introductions because we do have some new Planning Commission members. So let's start at the end there.
Hi everyone, Robert Lane, City Council Planning Commission since January 1st this year.
Welcome.
Welcome.
I was 12.
Been a while, Gail, because you and I served together on the planning commission.
Yeah, and then she went off for a long time.
Us as well.
Carrie and McMichael, Planning Commissioner. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yep. Ryan Andrews, Community Planning Manager.
Jeff Gadman, Chair of the Planning Commission. Thank you for hosting us tonight. This is always a good meeting. I remember when I was on City Council, I was thinking I should have brought my old name block.
You get a keep.
But thank you very much.
So I'll jump in. We've got Jeff flanked, Vanessa Dolby, Community Economic Development Director.
Spencer Zeman, Planning Commissioner.
Elliot Kirk, Planning Commissioner.
Nick Dunning, Lacey City Council.
Carolyn Cox, Lacey City Council. Robin Vasquez, Lacey City Council.
Michael Stedman, Council.
Lenny Greenstein, Council.
Malcolm Miller, Deputy Mayor.
I'm Andy Ryder, the Mayor Lacey, and
Rick Walk, City Manager.
with that, let's turn it right over to Vanessa and Ryan.
The microphone button over here. Well, good evening, and I'm excited to have this joint meeting this evening. And just kind of rolling us back to 2024, if you all think back, we actually adopted a 2-year work program with the Planning Commission. So given that two-year work program, that rolled 2024 and 2025 together into one work program. So this evening, we have a unique opportunity to have a good discussion about our comprehensive plan, which was one of our major work program items in that 2-year work program, with the Planning Commission at the table to talk about our land use element and land use alternatives. And you can see we have some maps behind you. So this discussion about land use alternatives, it will inform our preferred alternative as we move forwards. This, among other community feedback, as well as a community open house that we're going to have tomorrow evening in this same space. After that portion of the discussion, we're going to have some conversation about 3 specific elements of the comprehensive plan: our transportation element, our climate element, and our housing element. And we have a number of consultants and staff here to go through those presentations and to provide some background on these elements. There's been a number of amendments to the Growth Management Act and other requirements underneath these specific elements, so provide some background and education on that side of the ledger. So once we get through all of that and we get to the end, it would be really, really helpful for us as staff if we could hear from the council in terms of what their priorities are as it relates to some of those specific elements. And we'll remind you again at the end, and of course there will be lots of opportunity for comments and questions throughout the process. Did you have a question now?
I was just going to ask if that was your diplomatic way of asking us to hold questions until the end.
No.
Oh, okay.
Please ask. And then before I hand it off to Ryan, I do just want to thank the Planning Commission. Just because we had a 2-year work program, it doesn't mean a lot of work did not get done last year. A ton of work did get done, and we'll kick it off with accomplishments and then move into the nuts and bolts of the comprehensive plan moving forwards. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Yep, great. So if we can pull up the presentation, it looks like it's coming up. So yeah, as Vanessa mentioned, 2024 was a busy year for the Planning Commission. We did adopt a 2-year work program, and we'll go through those things that were part of the Planning Commission's work program in 2024 before we move into what's ahead of us here. So really, it should be no surprise, the biggest part of our 2024 work program was setting the stage on our 2025 comprehensive plan update. This was, and I think the council will see this being very familiar because we did go through a very similar process with the council that we did with the Planning Commission as we set the stage and began the process with a visioning exercise that we not only did with the council and the Planning Commission, but the Youth Council as well. We reviewed and moved forward a public engagement plan that we then put forth into motion starting this last summer through various outreach methods. And you can see the picture here. This is Hans and Lindsay at Children's Day back in October with a booth on updating our comprehensive plan, and had some fun activities for kids to do as well. And then also had kind of our summer, fall engagement culminated in a rather large survey to the public, which now all of you have been briefed on. I briefed the Planning Commission on the results of that last week. So a very overwhelming response that we got from the community that gave us a lot of different priorities. Obviously, you've heard kind of what those priorities are, and you'll see some of that reflected in what we'll be presenting tonight. But also, too, as Vanessa mentioned, we do definitely want to check in with the council as far as what the council's priorities are. And I think that would be helpful for the Planning Commission to hear as well. And then, major updates. So, and that's why we're here tonight. Land use, housing, transportation, and climate change and resiliency are really going to be kind of those major kind of hallmark type element updates that you'll see coming forward. Obviously, we'll have other updates to other elements that will be coming your way as well, things like our economic development element, our utilities element, but those aren't going to be as major. And really, I think the reason that these are so large is, as Vanessa mentioned, we've had a significant amount of state influence in local planning where there hasn't been as much in the past, and now there are more mandates, if you will, coming down from the state that we're responsive to, and you'll hear that tonight. And that's really going to be kind of the theme across all the different elements is kind of what we're dealing with in terms of adjusting to some of the state requirements that are coming our way. It's a kind of new territory. I've not seen this amount of kind of state influence in local planning processes in my career. If you ever want to see what the roadmap for a comprehensive plan looks like, this is it. And it's kind of messy. It's not linear. And this is on our conference room wall in our department, and it kind of outlines everything that we did do and are doing related to updating our comprehensive plan. The good news is that we are about 2/3 of the way done with this process. So, we've done so much pre-work with community, with the Planning Commission, with our various, Youth Council, Commission on Equity, with all of our advisory boards, Planning Commission, and now we are ready to start moving towards writing goals and policies. And so, as I think we've mentioned in the past, that the council has really wanted to make sure that you have your fingerprints in this comprehensive plan. So as we bring these various elements to the Planning Commission, we will concurrently be bringing them to you for your review and input along the way, which is a little bit of a unique process, not something that we've done historically, but you've told us loud and clear that you definitely want to be involved in this process. All that to say, this will be done by the end of 2025. So here we are with about 10 months left until we need to get this work finished up. So obviously the big part of our update was our preparation for our 2025 update, but there were other accomplishments along the way. I just want to highlight a couple, have a couple slides here. A significant one that took about a year and a half was the neighborhood commercial code amendments. This was adopted by the City Council back in July. So a recommendation came from the Planning Commission, I want to say probably May or June, prior to going to the Council in July. And so this actually took up a significant amount of the Planning Commission's time in early 2024. We are required to do a critical areas ordinance update, making sure that we're incorporating best available science. That's something that is required by the Growth Management Act and state law. And so good news is we're actually kind of through this process. So this is something that we've been doing a little bit in the background as we've been working on the comprehensive plan, knowing that this requirement was coming our way. Planning Commission has reviewed and made recommendation on the critical areas ordinance update, and it will be coming to the council for a work session at your actually next work session, February 25th. Also completing, right now, the Planning Commission is reviewing, and I think the council will be having a briefing soon on updates to our Public Works Development Guidelines and Standards. A council work session coming up in 2 weeks on this as well. So Public Works Development Guidelines and Standards, there's kind of that background document that tells you how to develop everything that goes into a kind of a site development. So things like pipes in the ground, stormwater, road standards, those kinds of things. That's where those requirements are contained. The last time that document was updated was in 2017, and will be updated by the end of this, well, probably by the end of the spring. So Planning Commission's been reviewing these chapters through Public Works. They've been bringing those forward. We want to make sure Council's aware of some of these amendments. The Planning Commission will be holding a hearing in March, so you can anticipate that probably the draft recommended amendments would be coming from the Planning Commission to the Council in April. We're also required to implement Senate Bill 5290. 5290 is the permit processing ordinance, and so it has required us to change some of our permit processing requirements. That went through the Planning Commission, then was adopted at the end of last year. We will be implementing more of that as we do move forward, some amendments to specifically Chapter 1 of the Development Guidelines, which is our permit processing requirements. So stay tuned on that front, but we have done some of the things that we needed to do to comply with some of the state legislation at the end of last year. Planning Commission, this isn't something that went to the council, but the Planning Commission did review a rezone application on Martin Way. This is a property that was in Thurston County that was a rezone application. It did come forward and it had a little bit of controversy to it and did require a few meetings to be associated with that. The Planning Commission did make a recommendation, and that recommendation actually went to Thurston County's Planning Commission, so that it was kind of a joint review of a rezone application, given that it was in our urban growth area and our joint planning responsibilities there. And we do have reviewing right now the commute trip reduction plan, which the Planning Commission will be reviewing at their next meeting, and then I do believe this will be coming to the council very soon as well. So I'm going to, with that, kind of transition into our various sections that we have in front of you tonight. But before I do that, I just want to kind of give you kind of an overview of what, as from a staff perspective, what the goals of this update to our comprehensive plan are. So number one, we want a readable and usable plan. And our focus for this update really has been to make this Lacey's first web-based comprehensive plan. So instead of it being a PDF document or just a paper document that sits on the shelf, we want something that is easily accessible, that people can pull up and understand. And so we actually have a website URL reserved, and we'll be putting as we move forward, we'll be putting draft goals and policies and those kinds of things on the website. And so for all intents and purposes, the comprehensive plan that we adopt in 2025 will be a web-based comprehensive plan. We want to make sure it reflects the community's vision, and we talked a lot about that already, making sure that it's integrated and relatable between elements. So we want to make sure, as somebody once said, everything is related to everything, and that people can kind of understand that as they move through the document. And that's one advantage of doing a web-based plan, is that we can not only organize things by elements, but by topics as well, to show what is interconnected in terms of what's crossing across various elements. Making sure that it's streamlined, simplifying zoning and development standards. Obviously, as we've discussed before, a lot of the work on the development standards will come in future work programs over future years. But this really will set that high-level policy that will be really important to achieving that. And then finally, I think it goes without saying, but meeting the GMA, the Growth Management Act requirements and the new laws that are coming down, not only new laws that are have previously applied, but also we're hearing of new laws that sounds like we may have to react to pretty quickly as well coming out of the legislative session right now. And you'll hear more about some of those GMA requirements as we move forward. So with that, any questions, comments before we move to the next section, which would be land use?
No, let's,
Maybe. So we'll do some switcheroo. If you want to bring up the presentation on the land use element.
Maybe Vanessa for the day.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking about land use this evening. I'm Hans Shepard. I'm a senior planner on the long range side of things. I'm going to give you a quick background on what land use is all about, and then actually do a fair amount of review, kind of present a lot of this content to each one of you separately, but one of the goals of tonight is to get some conversation going about the different alternatives that we're looking at. So we'll get into that in a second. And I'm looking at my screen, but I'm up there. Okay.
So you'll have to use that.
There we go. Big target button. There we go. Thank you. So first section here talks about legislative updates. So really what we're talking about is requirements for 2025. A lot of these are the same as they were within the 2016 update. But a big component of the land use element is really ensuring that we have a sufficient land allocated to different types of uses over that next 20-year planning horizon. So a comprehensive plan runs for the next 20 years. So looking at our current land today, making sure that what we have available in the future is going to accommodate our projected growth. So that has to do with housing, that has to do with number of jobs, and it has to do with just kind of the land that's allocated to those types of uses. It also requires us to identify land specifically for public purposes. So while we need to make sure that we have residential areas and commercial areas, we also need to make sure that as a city, we can support those areas. So things like transportation corridors, recreation, schools, public uses, need to make sure that we have enough land allocated for those types of uses over that planning horizon as well. And then also, one of the things that's actually new for this update cycle, but it's not a new concept to us, is strategies to increase physical activity and reduce per capita vehicle miles traveled. And really what that means in practice is bringing where you live, where you recreate, and where you work closer together. So something we've definitely worked with a lot in the past, but this time it's actually specifically a requirement of the land use element. So that's something we'll be paying attention to as well. And then we also need to make sure that it's consistent with countywide planning policies. So all of our neighboring jurisdictions are also going through this process. We need to make sure that we have consistency between all of our plans.
so are we doing this land use update only within our city limits or within our urban growth area and our city limits?
We're doing it within both our city limits and the urban growth area.
Okay, that's what I
Yep.
thought. Yeah.
So our 20-year planning horizon includes both the city as it is today, but then also our urban growth area, which is where we're projected to kind of grow into the future.
Okay.
Yep. So on the land capacity front, one of the key components of that, or one of the things that really truly informs this process, is our buildable lands report. And this is something that Thurston Regional Planning Council pulls together every couple of years, and it essentially looks at all of the different land that we have, and then looks at our future population projections, and then matches those up, and then does an analysis to find out if we have sufficient land available to accommodate that growth. Quick summary of that report, the answer is yes. Based on current land capacity, we do have enough land to accommodate our projected growth numbers. And we also, one of the other questions that it asks in that report is, do we have a sufficient density to really qualify as an urban community? And I will point out that that is 4 units per acre, which over time may actually be lower than what we need to be. But based on that metric today, we are accomplishing those objectives as well. The one I did highlight up there is from our thirst and climate mitigation plan. That actually sets a little bit more of an ambitious goal of 72% of urban area housing within a half mile of city centers, corridors, or neighborhood centers. This is actually something that we touched a fair amount on when we were doing our neighborhood commercial code update and reviewing that process. And right now, we're actually not hitting that benchmark. So we're right around that 57%, and our target is 72. Yep.
How did are we achieving urban densities for new development in urban areas target get set at 1/4 of an acre? That's gigantic.
So it's 4 units per acre, but yeah.
4 units per acre.
Well, yeah, however you want to spread them out, but you
Sure.
could put 4 units equidistant apart on an acre, and that would be 1/4 acre lots, which is very large. Like,
Yeah,
where
so-
did that come from?
It's from our buildable lands report, but originally from Thurston County. That's how Thurston County defined rural versus urban land use densities. So that's right now one of the metrics that's used, but it
Is that
may well be something that we
comparable
look at in the
in
future.
other counties? Like, do we know how they define urban in other counties? Is it close?
So I think where that came from specifically, as Hans mentioned, it came from the Sustainable Thurston work that was done in 2013 as far as what was urban and what was rural. The 4 units per acre was at the time, I believe it was established through case law through the Growth Management Hearings Board as far as what a minimum density was. There was case law basically requiring certain jurisdictions to become more dense, and the case law at that point established that around 4 units to the acre was an urban density.
That's how they drew the line.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, they drew the line without saying they drew the line. They said, we don't want to do a bright line threshold, but they also established case law as being 4 units per acre.
This is what an urban area looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 units per acre. Okay,
So-
thank you.
From our most recent buildable lands report, high-level takeaways, yes, we have land capacity, and yes, we're meeting that benchmark. I did throw a bullet up here that calls out middle housing. Jennifer is going to speak to that a fair amount later, but I did want to point out specifically the increase in units and how that's actually has the potential to greatly increase our current land capacity without changing our boundaries or anything like that. So there is new legislation that's coming in that does influence those numbers and is something new that we're going to have to pay attention to in our future projections and calculations. But yeah, so this section should look familiar to pretty much all of you. I believe Ryan presented on some of this to council, and then I presented on some of this to Planning Commission. As part of the 2024 community survey that we did, we went out to the community and asked a range of questions, one of which had to do with assuming that we have X number of additional people that are moving to the area, where should we allocate enough residential units to accommodate that growth across the city? And we broke it out by different types of housing. So we had detached homes, duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, mixed use, small multifamily and large multifamily. And then folks were able to drop pins on the map where they might envision a multifamily or a single family or something in between. And with all that information, we actually created these different heat maps that you see here. So each one of these represents the feedback that we heard, feedback specific to lower density all the way up to higher density and mixed use. The yellow represents anywhere that at least one pin was dropped, moving into the redder colors where that represents a higher density of pins that were dropped in those areas based on that feedback. Later on, we have kind of a summary of all of these where it's all consolidated in one, but I did want to give you kind of the more granular look at what that looks like. And I jumped ahead. All right, and then we also did it with commercial. So using those same population projections, we gave the survey participants the opportunity to drop pins where they envision different types of jobs being allocated across the city. So again, we broke it out based on either commercial, larger commercial centers, mixed use, or light industrial uses. And then that led us to these maps here that you see as far as where those densities are that are showing up. And I believe, yep, there we go. Okay. So, and then these two maps are a consolidation of all of the residential feedback and then all of the commercial feedback. And then the residential feedback is also weighted based on number of units. So, say a single family PIN is going to have a lower weight than a multifamily structure. But with that weighting, you kind of see the heat maps that have been created here. Some interesting things that did pop out to us. The Woodland Creek wetlands was a popular location. Makes things difficult for us. I imagine that has to do with it was just a known undeveloped location within the community. So it's encouraging to see that at least people are spending the time on the maps to identify undeveloped areas where it could make sense to put development, given that feedback didn't necessarily have all the information. So the wetland complex that's out there wasn't well represented in the aerial view, but that is a potential limitation. But some other areas that are showing up over in the Woodland District or the South Sound Center, we start to see kind of a higher or heat reddish color in that zone, and then also out towards the Rack and the Nisqually Middle School. We see some clustering there, and then also around the Cabela's Quaymuth Village development.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really an important point that we need to make as we go forward in this process. Where is the actual buildable lands? Where is residential allowed? Where is commercial allowed? Mm-hmm. And we have to start there, because if it's not allowed, then you either need to change the zoning or, right? And so, and otherwise we fall into, let's put density in areas that are sensitive, and so it'd be really nice to see where, according to our zoning, where is the residential and commercial allowed, and then we need to make some decisions based on that. Where's the best place for that growth to happen? I think that's a good sort of touch point we need to have.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely something that we're going to be paying attention to as we move forward. We chose not to include limitations on that first map, just because at some point it gets too busy and the feedback kind of gets lost in the details. And what we actually discovered or were aware of, but something that became relatively apparent as we were moving through this process, is that we have huge chunks of residential across the community, and a lot of our commercial actually is allows residential uses as well within it. We have actually very little commercial within our city that is purely commercial and doesn't actually allow residential uses in some capacity or another.
Isn't some of that more recent adjustments to code, though? Like perhaps when commercial first came into some of those areas, there wasn't permitted to have residential also, and so we've got development that happened 30 years ago when we couldn't have both. And now we've updated the code, but like development hasn't caught up. I think it's interesting that on the other heat map, people want to cluster both our commercial density and our residential density both in that northern area of the city. So folks see a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I'll just point out, and you can see the Cabela's Quaymuth Village area as being both a high importance from a commercial and a residential standpoint as well. Understanding that, there are going to be some limitations as far as our influence in planning for the future of that area. But it does show, we will control outside of the boundary of what's put in tribal trust, and how important those properties are for the future of that area, and how it's really important to get the zoning, the land use and the zoning right for what surrounds that area.
Yeah, so to your point, Robin, there's been a shift in philosophy as generations got younger. Back in the 50s and 60s, people tended to, no, I want my industrial here, I want my commercial here, and I want my residential way over here, and I don't want to listen to any of that. And there's been a shift now in desire as people have gotten into the idea of, no, I want to be able to walk to work, right? I want to be able to walk to the store, buy my gallon of milk and pound a hamburger, and then walk home. And so people are more desirous of having the mixed use, yeah.
And for 2025, that is one of the things that is being elevated and something that we're going to have to pay attention to progressively more than we have historically. So it's good that a lot of our feedback is bearing that out as something that the community is also looking for. So moving into a little bit of backstory here, currently we have adopted within our 2016 comprehensive plan one map that doubles as both our zoning map and our future land use map. It looks kind of like the one that's up on the screen there. It has 30-some different zoning designations in it. But some of the distinctions between what the role of a future land use map and a zoning map. A future land use map is supposed to identify the general location and intensity of land uses at kind of a higher level. It's also the intent of the future land use map is to implement the goals and vision of the comprehensive plan. So it's kind of a visual representation of what a comprehensive plan is. It's also a much more simplified version. So we do have 3 examples of what that is behind you that we're going to get into in a second. But it simplifies it down into, instead of having low density residential, moderate density residential, high density, it would just have a residential bucket or a commercial bucket. And then zoning, by contrast, identifies the currently permitted uses of any specific property. So it gets down to the granular detail, talks about setbacks, number of units, proximity, buffers, things like that. It's a lot more detailed in its character, and it's also represented by our Title 16 of our Lacey Municipal Code. So it's really, yeah, there we go, 34 different zoning designations. And then it implements the future land use map. So it's kind of our action document that we reference as we're going through, but everything kind of has to connect back to both our comprehensive plan and our future land use map to make sure that we are consistent in our decision-making all the way through. Our current approach, I kind of got ahead of myself here. So yeah, our current approach, we've adopted one map, our zoning map, as both our zoning map and our future land use map. The challenge there is that it requires all proposed zoning changes to be routed through our legislative review process. And that's something that's only allowed once per year. And it generally takes around a 6 to 9 month review process based on the requirements of that. The proposed approach would be to actually separate them. So maintain our zoning map as it is today, but then also create a separate future land use map for the 2025 comprehensive plan. And this has the potential to streamline the review process. Provided zoning requests are consistent with the future land use map, it wouldn't necessarily have to get elevated up to that legislative review process. It would allow us to review them more incremental throughout the year instead of only waiting until that January bundle comes through. So it would allow us to be a lot more responsive and then potentially shorten the review timeline as reviews come in. So that's our recommendation for this update cycle. And with that in mind, good?
I was just going to say, it's like an outline, right? It's the outline that you put together before you write the essay. So it might not have all the details in it, but it's a general sketch of like what we want to see in the future that we can create up front and then build the details later, because the full process to get to the fully detailed essay version of the thing is much longer.
Exactly.
Also, bonus, it's a cute acronym.
Flum.
Yeah, flu or flume, depending on how you.
So, and one of the things I'll just clarify as well is that by adopting our zoning map into our comprehensive plan, we are only allowed to amend by state law our comprehensive plan once a year. And so that's why we do those requests on an annual basis, is because we have to lump them up with any annual comprehensive plan amendments. With adopting a future land use map, if you are amending the future land use map, that is what gets adopted in the comprehensive plan. So if you are proposing an amendment to that, that's part of that annual review. If you are adjusting the zoning, if it's consistent with the comprehensive plan, future land use map, then we can take those applications out of cycle. So they are not required to be bundled together with those annual comprehensive plan amendments. And we'll, potentially add a little bit more flexibility and allow for some more potential adjustments along the way.
Go ahead.
You have several businesses that are run out of homes. Landscaping business, a perfect example of that. At the time they were light commercial, does the new zoning map now make that business unable to operate?
So that business would be allowed to operate in its current form and function as long as it's operating in that location. If it were to close down, there would be limitations on a new business starting up in that location if it wasn't a permitted use. But it wouldn't prohibit something that's currently operating today from continuing to operate.
And then Hans,
What is the guarantee on that? Because I've been in that exact same situation. I ran a construction company, and police came, said, well, you're licensed, bonded, insured, it's light commercial, you're fine. So, but now if they start going off the zoning, now they'll, your social officer would say, sorry, you're not zoned for this area.
If I can answer your question maybe in a different way, we authorize, and this would be absent land use map, zoning map conversation. We authorize home-based businesses, which are going to be a different scale of a business than maybe a large construction site that would have, let's say, backhoes and stuff on it, right? That home-based business we allow in the city, we actually have over 1,000 home-based businesses that operate within this city out of, their garage or whatever it might be. And so those are currently authorized. These amendments wouldn't change any of those rules as we're talking about it today. It's a conversation about the intensity and the size and scale of that business. If it's operating as a commercial building out of a commercial structure, having other affiliated uses such as, storage yard for equipment, that's going to be a different scale than a home-based business, and then that would fall into a different category. I don't know if that addresses your question, but they are two separate things.
Yeah, I am worried about how there is no guarantee that they won't be touched, because you know how business bureaucracies work. We make these new zones and say, oh, sorry, you're no longer zoned for that area. Right now, you're saying that the existing businesses would be fine, but as they close down, it would go under the new zoning. I understood that. But is there some sort of written into the plan for that, since we are changing zoning areas? I mean, or when they have to be notified?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be considered a non-conforming use. We do have policies and language within our adopted codes that dictates how we would operate. And it sounds like even in your example, it was permitted to continue operating.
Correct.
So, yeah, that language would not be changing as part of anything that we're discussing here today.
Well, the only reason it was continued was they looked at the zone and said it's like commercial, there's fine. So, but once we changed that zone, if he looked at it and said it's now residential, sorry.
I think what we're trying to do is be more flexible, not we're trying to have more flexibility go into our zoning, not the other way around, which is what I think you're talking about.
But we eliminated the light commercial, did we?
I think
that's what that used to cover, was light commercial areas with residential.
So any change there would be a rezone at that point, and that would be its own specific process, and we would explore all of those situations before anything of that nature would happen.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I just, to help reassure you, I mean, I've been in land use for over 38 years and all over the county, and I've never seen a rezone shut down a business. It becomes, like Hans said, a non-conforming use, and they're allowed to operate as long as they continue to operate. Once that business shuts down, then the questions start to happen. But an existing business, I've never seen an existing business shut down because of a change in zoning.
Well, thank you.
We have a full chapter that's dedicated to that exact situation, and no part of that is going to be changed as part of what we're talking about here.
All right, thank you.
So getting back to our future land use maps, we pulled together 3 different alternatives. there's the top one there is what we're calling the current conditions, or no change alternative. And essentially what it is a simplified version of our existing zoning map. So as I kind of said earlier, it takes all the residential, puts it in a residential bucket, takes all the different types of commercial, puts it in a commercial bucket, and does the same for our mixed use, our light industrial, and then our open space and our institutional. So that's really kind of the no change alternative. And then we also created what we're calling a residential alternative. And this one would support residential uses within more areas of the city. The map would prioritize expanded housing options over other potential uses. And then conversely, we created a commercial alternative. And this one, land uses would support commercial uses within more areas of the city. The map would ensure key locations and transportation corridors are maintained for commercial uses and future job growth. And the next slide is those three alternatives. And I do want to say before we get into this too much that these are really created to generate conversation and have discussions. If I'm looking forward and trying to project what will likely happen, it'll be some blend of all three of these. That's the end result. But for conversation purposes, we tried to create kind of two opposites to spur that discussion. But the three that we have, so the current conditions, one is there over on the left. It's also in the room here behind you guys. The center one is the residential alternative, and then the one on the right is the commercial alternative. And the areas that are really undergoing most of the color change, at glance, these might look pretty similar, but is within our mixed use zones. Our mixed use zones are that kind of orange color there. A lot of those are actually what we would probably casually assume or view as our commercial zones, but a lot of them allow different types of residential uses there. So the residential alternative does change a few different zones to a little bit more leaning towards residential. But the commercial one is really the one that you see the most change, with a lot more red popping up in different areas of the map. But this is something that we shared with the Planning Commission, and I believe, is this your guys' first time seeing it?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
council's first time.
So, yeah, we wanted, yeah.
Real quick, could you describe the open space institutional and what kind of organizations or things would be located there?
Yeah, so that's everything from parks to schools to fire stations to City Hall, St. Martin's, churches, also wetland designated areas, open space, things like that. It's kind of a catch-all for either municipal or environmental locations. Any other questions on that one? But yeah, so these are three different alternatives. Our hope tonight is not to necessarily get a direction from you guys completely, but we did want to hear any initial thoughts, feedback, ideas that you have. Our plan is to actually roll these three different alternatives out at our open house tomorrow and get additional feedback there. These are also informed based on the heat maps that we shared with you guys earlier. But yeah. So that I might open it up to the room with any thoughts or feedback you guys have.
My first blush, and it's something that we've talked about and we know we need to address at some point, so I'm not sure if we can address it now or if we're going to kick the can down the road. But we know in southeastern part of our urban growth area, a lot of that land there is an environmentally sensitive area that's really not, cannot accommodate growth, which then makes you think, why is it in our urban growth area? And so we know at some point we need to shift that that land out of our urban growth area into an area that makes more sense for the growth to happen. To me, it would make sense that we are looking at that now as we're going through our comp update. Maybe it doesn't happen now, but we should at least have some input on, say, where's the boundary, and if we were going to move and add that square foot, that area to the rest of our city, where would we do it? Where does it make most sense to do that? Because we know we got it's going to happen sooner or later. So what's your thoughts on the timing and that?
Yeah, so a couple things that come to my mind. So what we're talking about is the McAllister Geologic Sensitive Area, which is between Yelm Highway and Meridian Road, very southeast corner of those maps. We, within our 2016 comprehensive plan, have policies in there suggesting that that area be removed from the urban growth area. We don't have any recommendations for where that area should be added to, but we wanted the Thurston County to be able to explore that option. And I think, I think we're aware that the modification of the urban growth area is actually a function of the county commission and not the city of Lacey. We can recommend, but we can't require.
Sure.
And so I think that's something that we can definitely pull forward in our next comprehensive plan. And because that's already in our comp plan, we can keep that going. Just generally looking at if we were to, remove and replace that area with something else, where would it go? Well, chances are it would likely go out kind of Marvin Road northeast.
That's,
the problem with that, and we could take a harder look at it, is a lot of that is what I would call very suburban level development, like ranchettes on half an acre or an acre. Mm-hmm. In order to get to the larger swaths of more developable property, you really have to go much farther out Johnson Point to be able to get there, because those half acre, 1 acre little ranchette properties, they're all on individual wells or maybe community wells and septics. They're not easily convertible to a more urban style development. So I would say the easier process would be to actually remove something from the urban growth area to actually add it. I don't know if we have something. We can certainly take a more in-depth look at it, but something that would be subsequent, or something that would be kind of relative in area somewhere else where we could easily add it and get that much development capacity.
It makes sense for it to be within a certain distance of existing utilities, so on and so forth. I, back in 2016, wanted to, to take a look at that, and I know that that's why it's maybe one of the reasons why it went in 2016, but here we are, another comprehensive plan later. I just don't want us have to wait another 10 years before we're doing this with the way the city has been growing.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I'll just bring up, and this is an aside, but there is a urban growth area swap conversation that's been happening at the county,
Yes.
and new rules that have been coming from the state. So the state is working on finalizing some of those rules, and so I think this conversation actually fits well into that separate conversation that's happening. I think, as Ryan mentioned, policy language speaking about urban growth boundaries, but in terms of the land use map itself as it exists today, if we're looking at maybe it being an area not within the city in the future, potentially looking at having that be a lower density land use designation would be an appropriate application for that area for now. Because if it ever is going to go back into the county, it would need to meet that more rural density conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to be at least making a recommendation where we think it makes sense for that future density to go based off of, the county doesn't necessarily have the same insight that we do on that. And I'd rather be making the recommendation than playing catch up, trying to convince the county to do something else if we're going through this process. Good.
It's been a long interest of mine in trying to look out ahead toward growth trends so that we don't get ourselves into the uncomfortable conflict that we see ourselves in Northeast Lacey, the tensions between residential and commercial light industrial growth. I mean, when the planning that had happened for the, as I understand it, for the industrial commercial had happened, I think Weyerhaeuser still had most of that land that is now Jubilee and some of the other things was forest, and as far as the city knew, working forest. And then suddenly, all this residential develops there. And ever since then, it's created this tension. And so I'm hoping that as we're looking toward these zoning maps, that we are analyzing current and future growth patterns so that we can head off some of this conflict and plan for a more graceful growth for the city. I think that would be my biggest overarching goal for Lacey. Having lived in Florida many years and seen the horrible tensions that have happened there, I just really, really don't want that to happen to Lacey. So can any of the staff comment on where we are with that and how that?
I think that's a good point. As TRPC has pointed out, technically we have enough land to accommodate growth. In reality, given market conditions, where utilities are at, so on and so forth, what's the reality of can we actually accommodate that growth, and what will it take for us to do that? That's the thing that we keep sort of glossing over, right? Yeah, technically we do, but in reality we actually don't, because we don't have the right infrastructure in place, and that's what we need to be focusing on, is making sure we can get infrastructure to the areas that will accommodate our future growth. And unfortunately, as we know, majority of that is in our urban growth area. We're not directly responsible for that, and so that's the big issue. That's been the big rub that we've had for a long time.
Yes, so it'd be interesting to see a future picture of what Lacey 2045 would look like.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
So, I have a couple comments, and I think, looking at the future land use maps, I'm always shocked at how much yellow is on all of those maps. So it's just a reminder that Lacey is far and away residential, especially our urban growth area is primarily residential. And so, we forever have this kind of struggle as being a bedroom community for somewhere else. And what we're saying, and what we're projecting is that we need more of everything to come to Lacey. We need more housing, we need more people, we need more jobs. And so there will be a conflict, and we'll try to figure the best way out, to figure that out. Some of it is, these were decisions that were made long before us, on how some of these land uses, occurred, especially in Northeast Lacey with some of the master plan communities out there. But one of the things I think is one of the biggest challenges for the next 20 years in needing more of everything to come into Lacey are some of the middle housing requirements. So those requirements that, require duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes to go essentially on kind of any lot. And those things have impacts, right? They have impacts in terms of neighborhood compatibility. They have impacts on infrastructure, or the lack of infrastructure, water and sewer line capacities and all those kinds of things. And so that's something that I think will be, we'll have to do our best in trying to address those things, because those are, again, state legislative requirements that we're responding to, and not necessarily something that, we can plan for. It's something that we have to do, and those codes have to be, done by June of next year. And so, it's not like we can plan for that and have time to adjust our, put in sidewalks in older neighborhoods and those kinds of things. Those things, can't happen at this point in that timeline. So, I think, especially given that so much of Lacey is residential, that's probably the biggest change coming down the pike for us in the next 20 years, is how our neighborhoods could potentially change as a result of some of the state requirements, requiring additional accessory dwelling units, limiting parking, or not, saying you can't have parking on associated with developments. It's parking requirements. I think that's something that changes a suburban community, that may not be able to adjust to that quite as easily as an urban Puget Sound community.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just kind of add, because it's always trying to look at your future land use and trying to build off existing patterns and have complementary and reduce some of the conflict. But I'm going to go back to earlier in the conversation. I think Jeff mentioned, the change in trend. So really, you have a separation of land uses as a result of, former land use disputes going back to the early 1900s because of impacts and nuisances, and that created your separation of uses. And now we're in a trend where people want to be in mixed uses, where they can work, live, walk to get their needs or those type of amenities. And so you're always going to have that conflict with your land use. The goal is trying to identify how you can get best efficiencies, the right type of neighborhoods together, and then use your design to try to reduce some of that conflict. Those master plan communities were just that. We're trying to combine certain types of land use together with open space and all the other amenities in schools and everything else. And that's the pattern. But again, you have that natural conflict between different types of uses.
Well, I'm only asking you, to be perfect wizards in projecting the future.
Another thing I think we have to really keep front of mind is that it's great that we know we're going to get more people. That's a given. But if we don't do something on the commercial side, we're not going to have the money as a city to support these additional households. I mean, bottom line is, we know we have a revenue issue already. We need more commercial. So we really have to keep that front of mind.
Yeah, and getting back to the land use maps, people have told us, this is through the surveys, housing is really important, but places to go are really important. The things like vibrant commercial districts are really important to the community. So you'll notice South Sound Center. So South Sound Center is shown on the left-hand side of the map, or left map, to give you some reference, is that we're showing a residential alternative where South Sound Center develops kind of a more mixed use, but we're also showing that maybe the old South Sound Mall stays hard commercial. And what does the community think about that? That's a question we'll be asking at the open house tomorrow night, because that is an area, we know it's important for a variety of different reasons, but that is one of them, is it's the tax generation associated with it and the uses that could bring, that in the future.
Great area for mixed use too.
Exactly.
What's wrong with commercial on the bottom and residential above too?
Right.
And we've
Allowed a lot of places.
Well, to echo what Lenny is saying, I look at this map where it says,
Can you please turn on your microphone?
well, an example is, the problem is we're looking at all these colored maps and we're not really looking at individual changes within the commercial community. So some of these areas that we're suddenly labeling as open,
Open space.
are currently light industrial commercial. An example of that would be the Carpenter Road 95, directly across from Miles Sand and Gravel. Mm-hmm. That little section there is now open space institutional. What happens to those existing businesses that have been there for 25 years? Sorry, your land that used to be valued at $1 million because it's commercial is now quarter of that value?
Just to be clear, we didn't change anybody's future land, based on the future land use maps, we didn't change anybody that was already in a commercial area to some other kind of designation, just want to be clear.
Well, according to the map, it went from light industrial commercial. I'm looking at the Lacey City Interactive map for that Carpenter Road, south of Carpenter Road, directly across from Miles Sand and Gravel. It went from purple, which is light industrial commercial, to the open space.
Yeah, so I will jump in. On those maps, you are correct. Those are dated maps. The ones behind you and the ones that we're rolling out tomorrow have actually captured that mistake and have remedied it. So if you look at the ones behind you,
it's already open space. The
it's
map
purple
that
or
is on.
It's already like industrial.
stays that way.
Oh, okay, right there, yeah.
Yep.
But
So
that is definitely one of the areas that we need to talk about for future growth, because we know what's, that it's only a matter of time before they're done with their activity there. We should be thinking ahead of what what is the appropriate zoning for there, for sure. And it's not open space. That's definitely was a mistake.
I was just going to say, and again, these are just to stimulate conversation. These are not things that we're necessarily proposing.
Yeah. Go ahead,
The
Vanessa.
intent is that to show different ranges of potential outcomes.
So the only thing I was going to add, kind of circling back to the commercial conversation, is as we look at what these land use designations mean and we start to develop that preferred alternative based on what we're hearing, we talk about the term that Ryan brought up, which was hard commercial, which is really just a term we kind of came up internally. And we've mentioned you can have residential with commercial. That could be really defined more as we're going to require some commercial when you develop residential versus this zone has flexibility. You can develop residential or commercial, whatever the market's going to bear in this area. And based on my experience, if there's not a requirement for commercial, you will most likely get residential. Mm-hmm. So as we talk about what these mean in our future our preferred alternative land use map, where are those places where we want to ensure there is commercial development for the city to be preserved? And where are those areas where we're okay allowing for that flexibility to go either way?
Yeah. And that's important too, because we have done that before. We've said you have to, I know you were, because we were thinking the same thing. You have to have commercial on the bottom floor, and it's sat empty for, 15 years.
Yep.
And that didn't serve its purpose either. And so there has to be a balance. The one thing I would say is that, do we still have 34 zoning designations?
Yep.
I mean, like, that's the first thing I would look at is that's, in my mind, way too many zoning designations. That's crazy. I would, and this sort of comes back to the conversation that we had when we were looking at our community commercial. And we really appreciate the Planning Commission doing a deep dive on that. It was a great process. I think we got to a better product. We included, the land, it was a great process. But we haven't done that with the rest of our zoning that may be just as out of line as our commercial. And I know that is asking way too much. Like, we just don't have the time. We've had this conversation, we don't have the time. And so what I'm seeing here is like, well, we don't have the time. Maybe what we'll do is have a more of a streamlined process based on our future land use map that people can come in and sort of rezone it themselves as it goes. I think in general that may work, but I don't know if it sort of, I think it might be kicking the can down a little down the road on what we really need to do within some of these zones that we know aren't working. Mm-hmm. And you know better than we do. Like, you're the ones that are probably running into this all the time. Like, man, people always come to counter and they want to do this, and guess what? We just can't do it. And so one of the things I'd like to see is, can we reduce some of these 34 zones down to something more simpler? Number one. Number two, if you, based on your experience within this current zoning, are there things that you believe that need to be changed right now and not kick the can down the road? And if there is, I'd like to talk about them. Like, what are those things based on your experience? And that should be a part of this comp plan update on this land use side of things.
So and Ryan, you can add, but I just want to roll back. There was a slide that Ryan showed that were kind of our goals with this comprehensive plan update. And one of them is a streamline and simplification. And the next phase of that process is looking at our zones. So we're taking this in two phases. First, taking this opportunity to establish this future land use map, underneath which we'll have our current, unfortunately, but yes, 34 different zones. But we'll say this land use designation implements those. So then phase 2, 2026 work program conversation, hopefully joint with Planning Commission here with Council, will identify which one of those do we want to, I'm going to use the word attack in terms of developing changes to those zones is a priority for us. And ultimately, through that public engagement process, conversations with you, conversations with the Planning Commission and the community, we can simplify that zoning, maybe collapse that into maybe 1 or 2 or 3 different zones that then implement the vision of the comprehensive plan on the next phase. So that's the goal.
Okay,
of
that
this
sounds
process.
like at least that's a plan. Yeah, Jeff?
3 words, form-based code.
Well, and we have talked about that, and we have talked about that. We care more about the function, design of it than the actual use. And is there other places within the city besides Midtown that we could do that? And I think that is a good conversation to have. Where that happens within the update, right? Do we do that in the second phase, or do we do that now? I think is sort of, I just don't know if we have how much time we have to sort of do that right now.
Yeah, and I'll just, I appreciate the feedback, but Planning Commission Chair. But form-based codes are difficult to administer in a built environment. So that's one thing that we've definitely learned with Midtown is that they're great because we like them. It's kind of like an open book test for a developer. You say, here, this is exactly what you need to do. Go and do it. And they bring that back. We say, yeah, you did it, and it's approved. That's a very simplified
Yeah.
process, but it works great for the city, it works great for developers. The challenge can be when you're dealing with what's called proportional compliance. So, somebody
Yes.
wants to modify the building, well, what part of that do you require them to bring up to code? So the devil's really in the details when you get to a form-based code, especially in a built context, so.
Yeah.
And it can be a year-plus process to do that because you have to take your existing land use balance and start building off of that, and it's very nuanced.
Could that possibly have knock-on effects with 5290 in terms of the time for processing requests?
Yes.
Sure. So, is there any other feedback that you want? I mean, obviously, we want to make sure there's enough neighborhood commercial within walking distance of our major density hotspots, right? That's something that is I think important. The other thing that's always been important to me is do we have open space parks within a 5-minute walk of our major density areas too? That's important as well. And we're seeing this as we've seen more and more multifamily come up, but people still need to go walk their dogs and be active and do those things that, since they're living in an apartment, they don't have a backyard. So do we have those type of amenities near our density as well? I didn't see that in sort of our overarching strategies. We do talk about, other things, having strategies next to density, but we didn't talk about that.
I think that's also part of our parks
Yeah.
strategic
Yep.
plan.
So
That we would have a park
Green
within
spaces and-
a quarter mile. It's like a 10-minute, 15-minute walk of, like, everyone in Lacey is supposed to live, or 80% of the people in Lacey are supposed to live within a 10-minute walk of a park. Like, that's on the
Something like
parks
that.
list already.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we do have level of service standards that are in our parks plan. As just a reminder, the parks plan was adopted last year, and we're not going to be, that's already kind of done, check the box. We're not going to be addressing that in this plan. I do hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
One of the things just to keep in mind is that we do have, especially with Kuya Park, we do have a lot of park land. Unfortunately, some of it is quite separated from some of our developed areas. But having said that, we also have things like private open space requirements and set-asides that are required as part of development that is also part of kind of filling that gap where our parks maybe are lacking in certain areas of the city or the UGA.
So if I can,
Yep.
if you were thinking you were leaning in one direction or the other, would it be residential, commercial, kind of just back to the status quo? Is there any thoughts on that from the council, the planning commission?
I mean, I agree with Lenny that we're going to have a problem if we don't incentivize the development of more commercial. But I like that we have more flexibility now than we did in the 70s and 80s when, like, the first wave of Lacey development happened, so that if we say there must be some commercial in this area, we can plan for it to be commercial on the bottom and then residential on the top, so we can have both. But I like the idea of requiring some commercial because we know that's what we need.
I agree that we need the commercial. I think we have to be really careful when we start mandating and requiring. We got, and Andy brought it up a little while ago, we had a real problem on Sixth, right? When we said, you will have commercial on the first floor. First floor sat empty with apartments above it for 15 years. That doesn't, we can't, as a jurisdiction, we don't know the market. The private sector is gonna build what they can sell. They're not going to build what they can't sell or rent. So we have to be a little bit careful in how we mandate certain things. We can't make the market.
Yeah, and I think we sort of addressed a lot of that when we did the deeper dive on the community commercial, and we came up with a good flexibility, right? Where, once you hit a certain percentage, then
Yep.
okay, right?
Incentivize what you want. Don't mandate it, incentivize it.
That's where I'm leaning as well. That's where we need to do. And obviously, you look at the map, there's a glaring lack of commercial in our urban growth area in the southeast part as well. We see that a little bit down next off of Yelm Highway, just because it's been sort of grandfathered in there. But I do feel like that's a glaring mistake, glaring area on this map where if we do a commercial alternative, we should probably be looking some way down that Marvin Road area and adding some more commercial uses over there.
I think a lot of the commercial issues are going to take care of itself through, what do you call it? The Martin Way corridor when we annex.
Study.
But that's a challenge, right? When is it going to annex? Because you're going to get fought the whole way by the county because that's their revenue too. But that'll take, so I'm less concerned because once we annex that, there's a lot of that part of the solution.
Low-performing commercial right now.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, low performing, I think it would perform better if it was in Lacey.
Agreed.
Well,
So-
and that reason why that makes sense is because it's connected to a corridor. And so that's the other thing where we want to make sure our land use is connected to our transportation. So, where's our major corridors? And along those corridors, is there enough commercial supporting it, right? And so, again, everything's connected to everything. We said that it's tough to look at the land use, and you don't want to look at the land use separate from the transportation. You have to overlap those two.
And that might be a very good segue for the next section, transportation. If I can just put a little, kind of maybe a bow on it and kind of looking at this future land use map and just some food for thought for the council, because yes, we had some challenges in the past where we tried to set a certain percentage of commercial on ground floor out of the downtown 2000 effort. The market crashed, there was a lot of issues, and it created some challenges. That's what moved us into the form-based approach. But also, we know that if you let the market dictate, we might not get the things we need for a long-term plan. And so sometimes you have to set the vision out there to look at what are the land uses you need for services, for the residents, for revenue, for the city, all those different pieces, and maybe look at that and have patience for the market to maybe catch up a little bit too. So there's a little bit of balance in there.
That's why you incentivize what you want.
Right.
Instead of mandating it, use the
But
carrot
also,
rather
though,
than the stick.
if you end up losing, what could be commercial lands to residential, because there's a lot of pressure on residential right now because of the housing crisis across the state, you will lose that resource forever, and that opportunity.
Well,
And so that's what I think just want to put out there as you go through this process and listen to community feedback and all these different things, thinking of that long vision as well as the short term.
Well, and this really makes a lot of sense as we're going right into the transportation element. One of the things that was missing on why that couldn't develop is because there was no parking for the commercial.
There's that piece.
Right, I mean,
There's several different barriers.
And so as we change that and put some more parking out front and just some of that sort of dictate, that's why it's so important to match up your land use with your transportation element, that makes sure they're mixing. So with that, let's go into the transportation element.
All right, thank you all.
Good conversation.
Planning commission stick around if they want.
Oh, that's this.
Planning Commission, you guys can technically go, but you guys mind sticking around in this next part? It's totally up to you.
It is the same presentation that the planning commission.
Oh, you already
has
had.
seen.
Okay.
Yeah, all of the next three presentations they've already seen,
Okay.
just
So-
so for their awareness.
It's totally up to you. I liked hearing your feedback too, so it's up to you.
Yeah,
What do you think, Jeff?
I want to give my appreciation for your time tonight and your input. It is easier for the planning commission because our job is to give you recommendations, right? It's based on what we hear from the community. It's based on our lived experience and stuff. Part of what makes it easier for us is when we get feedback from all of you and what your vision of the city is, because you guys are at the policy level. So if there's ever any kind of feedback you think the planning commission needs to hear before we kick a recommendation to you, please feed it through Ryan. We would really appreciate that.
Well, that's why I think it makes some sense you guys have the time to stick around to hear this next conversation on the transportation. Even though you've already heard it, it's totally up to you, but,
Council feedback.
yeah, council feedback. Let's go right into it then.
But you
Great.
don't have to stay.
But you don't
have to go. You don't have to stay.
I will say, remembering my past, the council does like to have an audience, okay?
Great, well, we'll jump right in. I'm Stephen Goodsell. I'm from Fair & Peers, a consulting firm based out of Tacoma, our Tacoma office. We're working on the transportation element as part of the comprehensive plan update. Today we'll cover some of the new requirements for the transportation element. We're going to talk about some of the transportation themes or things that we need to talk about in the transportation element, or just things that we typically talk about in terms of transportation. We'll look to the previous transportation plans from the city and how we're going to try to build off of those. And then we're going to ask for your feedback and give a brief status update. So as we've been talking about, these elements are all closely related. Transportation is very closely related to land use, to housing, to climate. These are all tied together. And so when we're talking about the transportation element as a whole, there's, we have to consider community engagement, funding, land use, all these things. We want to start by talking about the requirements, the things that we have to do as part of the transportation element. And a lot of these come from the 2023 legislative updates, particularly House Bill 1181 relating to the GMA, about climate response and comprehensive planning. And then there's also a couple of things related to transportation in HB 1110 and HB 1337, but those are more tailored towards land use and housing. So one of the first requirements out of HB 1181 is active transportation. We're using active transportation as a term instead of pedestrian and bicycle facilities, so we're just trying to condense everything, call it active transportation, and we need to, when we're doing our existing conditions reporting on like what does the city have in terms of inventory right now, we need to also consider active transportation facilities. We also, trying to be more inclusive of other modes, there's also the requirement for multimodal planning and multimodal level of service, or MMLOS is the acronym for that. In place of just looking at vehicle level of service, or LOS, there's been a large focus in the past on vehicle level of service. How are we serving vehicles, those driving? And now we just need to take a step back and consider all modes of transportation. How are the active transportation facilities serving those using them, and transit, etc. HB 1181 also requires that we talk about climate-related metrics, particularly GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions, and vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. Reducing policies particularly need to be included. Vehicle miles traveled is a metric that it's how many total miles, if you take every citizen in your city and how many miles they're traveling in a day, that's your VMT as a city. This table is from WSDOT. It identifies some strategies that have the potential to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And you can see those green dots just indicate the effectiveness of those. Land use, like we just talked about, multi-use land use zones, like those are going to be the biggest way to reduce your VMT, because you're going to have jobs and housing right next to each other, or retail and all that very close together. So reducing single occupancy trips and the length of those trips. We also need to talk about the ADA transition plan.
Go ahead, Ron.
Can you just give a real brief definition of road pricing?
Yeah, that's just an item that WSDOT considered in that table. That's not necessarily one that we're looking at, but road pricing would be like tolling or
Tolls.
parking,
Okay.
pricing, stuff like that. ADA transition plan, so the city already has an ADA transition plan, so as part of HB 1181, the requirement is to either create a plan if you don't have one, or update a plan if you do. So this would be part of an update, or to develop a schedule for making an update to the plan, if it doesn't happen during the transportation element. We also need to include a discussion of how funds will be raised, not only for city facilities, but also for state-owned facilities. So that's a new requirement. And then briefly talking about HB 1110 and HB 1337, you'll hear about these again, but the transportation element also looks ahead to the future impacts of these land use alternatives. How is this going to affect the transportation network? And so all of these land use and housing related requirements affect how transportation looks in the future. And so, yeah, that'll be part of TRPC's travel model and all these alternatives here. So as part of the Growth Management Act and Washington State Department of Commerce's grant allocations, they also hand those out with element checklists. So these are things that we have to talk about and include in the plan to meet the Commerce's review requirements. And so we don't have to talk about all of them. A lot of them overlap with these HB 1181 updates. So we have talking about existing conditions, including active transportation. We need to include a discussion about how are we mitigating existing impacts or gaps in the transportation network. We need to look at future year forecasts. So how are these alternatives going to look in the future and how does that affect the network? The list continues. We got the ADA transition plan here. We need to consider a multi-year financing plan based on the needs identified in the comprehensive plan. We also need to have intergovernmental coordination efforts described in the plan. So specifically consistency with the regional RTP is the requirement, which kind of leads into this next slide. TRPC also has a checklist, and because, they set it up with their regional transportation plan, just keeping it in line. Their RTP policy 4.I here is that the transportation element demonstrates how the city is making safety improvements, essentially, and that's the only item that is in addition to Commerce's checklist.
And if I could add one thing, Stephen, is a new process in this comprehensive plan update related to our transportation element that we have not yet gone through because it's a new process, is TRPC actually is required to certify our transportation element. So therefore they have that checklist. So just wanted to make that clear for the council that that's a new process that you may be hearing about through TRPC or other means.
And this is on that topic, maybe a little bit divergent from the presentation, but I've asked whether we could actually link to TRPC's checklist as we're doing community engagement or online engagement in Lacey, because I think it will be like the form that TRPC is going to use is very simple and straightforward, and it will identify like very specific things that Lacey's doing in the transportation area. It'll be accessible, right, for people who are not policy folks, and I think it would be useful to share that as we're working on the transportation element with our community.
Can you go back one slide?
Yep.
Reduce the number of traffic fatalities and serious injuries. Is that limited to cars, or does that also include pedestrians and bicycles?
Yeah, that's all inclusive. And the city is currently working on a safety action plan. That's a separate project effort, and so we will be linking or pointing to that plan specifically from the transportation element.
And when it says system investments, are we just talking about road work, or are we talking about like sidewalks as well?
It would be all modes.
All
yeah,
above,
so active
all above,
transportation too.
That is some of those sweet sidewalks in there.
Yep. So common things or typical things that we talk about in a transportation element, safety. The safety action plan is kind of the sidebar like we were just talking about, but we'll be pointing to it. The multimodal considerations and multimodal level of service. We talk about congestion, how are we, improving operations. We also talk about complete streets. That was something that was highlighted in the previous transportation plan or the current transportation plan that the city has from the 2012 comprehensive plan update, or I think it's called the 2030 transportation plan. We'll talk about that in a second. There's a theme about complete streets and the importance of complete streets in addressing all modes of transportation. We also talk about keeping things in a state of good repair and then keeping things sustainable for the future. So we're just going to breeze through some of these typical topics for sake of time. But the level of traffic stress is a new measure that a lot of jurisdictions are using for talking about multimodal level of service. How well are we serving those using active transportation? That ranges from LTS1 to LTS4. LTS1 being a very comfortable facility for people to use, LTS4 being uncomfortable for most. Just pretty much experienced bicyclists are the only ones comfortable using those, and that's typically just bicyclists in a road with heavy vehicle traffic. So these this is kind of just an analysis or a practice of looking at the city's infrastructure and assigning a level of traffic stress value to meet this multimodal level of service requirement, and then to identify gaps in the network that we can then address with better infrastructure. The idea of complete streets helps address a lot of that, building a corridor that serves transit vehicles and pedestrians and people biking and rolling. And so that's just a very, WashDOT is using this term a lot now. This is a very emphasized thing, and I think the city of Lacey was ahead of a lot of this discussion in 2012 in the previous comprehensive plan.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so with these upgraded wider roads with all of these amenities, how are we working to combat the amount of impervious surfaces that we have and the stormwater runoff that's going to come from that? Is that part of this planning process, or is that something separate?
That, yes, is something we'll consider, but it will be more of a design, like project by project design basis. I know that the city is talking about road diets in some areas, reducing the number of lanes, and so it's not always expanding or widening. We do try to consider, is this road too wide, and is there some way we can give some of this space back to pedestrians or to green space? So it's not just one way. Talking about sustainability, how do we account for cybersecurity threats, climate impacts, equity, and economic impacts over time? Those are things that we will try to include. So talking about previous plans, the 2012 comprehensive plan, the 2030 transportation plan I mentioned a minute ago, had this multimodal vision, and it said evaluating all transportation modes enables the city to address its future needs in a comprehensive manner and supports the goal of reducing dependency on single occupancy driving. And something that we've heard from the recent survey that went out for the comprehensive plan was that people are looking for a walkable community. It sounds like the community is on board with this vision, and so we're looking to build off of the previous plan as part of this comprehensive plan update. The pedestrian and bicycle plan from 2018 had 3 guiding principles: make it safe, make it connected, and build momentum, and identified and prioritized projects in a list. And so we're looking to use those projects that have been identified from these transportation plans as we build the next transportation project list for the transportation element. So, looking for feedback, any questions? We also have this prompt. What themes would you like emphasized in the transportation element based off of the typical topics and other things that we've discussed so far?
Well, I think when we talk about complete streets, I think that really one of the old ways that we did it, especially on our corridors, is we want to make sure we had super wide sidewalks, super wide bike lanes, other lanes, blah, 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 blah. Then you do it on the other side, right? But what you're doing in that case is you're requiring a ton more land. What I've been seeing other cities who have more density than we do, but it's something that we need to start thinking about now, is that more and more people are using like electrically assisted, bikes and scooters and stuff to commute. And what seems to be the best way to do that through design is not necessarily have a big bike lane on either side of a corridor, but to have a protected lane that can go in either direction that separates traffic and allows sort of this more of an open use, a path, a joint use path that people can commute on a little bit more. It can be on one side, it can be on the other side, it can be in the middle. Just that way you're not having to expand. You can stay within the footprint, but it's really more of a design standard. We don't quite have the densities, to sort of require that now, but we do have a couple major corridors that do run through our community, and it is something that when you hit a certain threshold, it's something maybe we need to look at design-wise. So we are preparing for the future on that. And it may be dramatically different than what we're doing right now, but if I think we don't at least consider that and sort of put it out there, then we might be having to play catch-up later. So I just not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great thought. So for WashDOT, they have a complete street standard, so any project over $500,000 has to be redesigned using a complete street vision. And so we're working on a couple projects right now as Fair and Pierce, where we're trying to fit stuff within their existing right-of-way or their existing constraints, and 2 shared use paths or 2 LTS2 or better is their standard. Facilities doesn't quite work. And so once you get to the design side of things and you're looking at actual right-of-way space, then you need to consider what's feasible. Mm-hmm. So from a planning level, we're not going to dive into every road corridor and what exactly is feasible. But from a policy perspective, we want to set, good policies that kind of set up the city to encourage that kind of design. And then when that engineering and feasibility comes around, those are the things that are considered right of way. Can we fit a shared use path on both sides or not? Do we need bike lanes here, or should we just do one shared use path? Those are all things that we can consider.
I really like the framing of the level of traffic stress as a way to evaluate what we're doing for our transportation element, because people can feel that. Like, how many people have kids? You can think of the places in Lacey where you wouldn't want your 4-year-old to walk on the sidewalk without you holding their hand tightly, right? That's what it is. I feel like even just the portion of college that's right outside of Mountain View Middle School where we've made those expansions and the sidewalks are nice and wide and lovely, we've got trees, that's like a level 2 maybe. And then right after that, where we haven't made the improvements, the sidewalk is narrow and people drive 40 miles down the road. It's the same street, it's a block apart, and it goes from like a level 2 stress to a level 4 stress. Yeah. That's really helpful for me, I think, because I'm a very experienced bicyclist, but I know all the places in Lacey where I wouldn't let my kids ride their bikes on the road or on the sidewalk. So I like that as a framing. I think we should use that and talk to people about that as a way of making plans for complete streets.
That's where my head was going to. It's like we sort of know where the traffic is at. We should have a sort of definitely a different design in mind for that.
It's a good point, though. There's parts of college that walking on that sidewalk, forget a 4-year-old, as an adult, cars are awfully close. You feel the wind when they go by. I mean, some of them are pretty tight.
We walked it before the 22nd roundabout.
One person at a time. Yeah.
And that's the other thing that we've heard, and working with the school district, there's areas where we're having kids walk to school and it's not safe. Like that in my mind, needs to be the highest priorities when it comes to completing, infrastructure for the safety of areas where, we know there's children. That should be definitely something that's within this element.
I know that the 2018 pedestrian bicycle plan talks about routes to schools, but I don't know if there was an official study done under the Safe Routes to School program that WashDOT has. I don't know if there's anything official from the city.
Go ahead.
That was actually part of what we worked on for Sustainable Thurston. Yeah. Was the safe routes to school. So there is an element somewhere in a book around here.
Well, we talk about it. We talk about it, some of the conditions. I don't think we've ever connected the dots, though.
And just so everybody's aware too, we have as staff worked with the school district on their actual maps that they give to the school, give out at the schools on their, safe walking routes and those kinds of things. So, there's connection there.
The plan definitely identified areas around schools specifically that needed improvement. So we'll build on that.
Well, just the level 4 just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies when you consider the percentage of Lacey's population that is older and would struggle to walk across a major thoroughfare. I mean, I live down near the intersection of College Street and Yelm Highway, and I won't cross there to go grocery shopping at Safeway, so I confine myself to QFC if I'm walking, because it's just not safe at all. And, you know, I see people out there with motorized wheelchairs or on walkers trying to get across these things, and it's not good.
Wait till we had rapid phase 3. Go across that street.
So do we have have we mapped out where in our city limits the LTS 1, 2, and 3, and 4 is? We haven't done that yet. This is just a concept.
Yeah, we're in the process of reviewing the matrix that we're going to use to identify what facilities meet those thresholds.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that would tell us a lot, and then it also sort of direct us where we need to be focusing on too. I mean, if there's a LTS 4 in an area that's highly dense, right, that's not good. Right.
And we also, like,
Timberline High School was an LTS 3 or 4 for.
Well,
there's no sidewalks up there, right? Yeah. Well, and TRPC also has done a study on, like, traffic congestion, not on every road, but on, like, the main arterials. And so we could probably look at, you know, what are the places in Lacey that are the main arterials that have really high traffic congestion numbers, like vehicle trips, and then look at also the traffic stress levels and find kind of the hot spots that have a lot of vehicle travel and are really high stress. And those might be like the areas we prioritize for improvements.
Yeah. The other one that we've obviously been talking about for a long time is trying to connect Midtown with the university and why we haven't seen probably more activity. You know, we're going to try to address that with a roundabout, but that is definitely something we've known for a long time, and we just haven't found a way to do it yet. And so I think that this will be helpful, sort of, again, looking where's the activity use, and then do we have the right infrastructure around it to be safe.
Well, and, you know, exit 111, the diverging diamond, that, you know, moves pedestrians pretty well. And it's, you know, quasi roundabout, I guess. I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's been interesting how they've done that. Okay, anything else? So, again, the only thing is we need to make sure we're overlapping the transportation with our density maps and making, that should be guiding us as well. I'm sure that's a part of this process.
Yeah, one thing too, I'll highlight that our pedestrian bicycle plan did really well is analyze the projects around land uses. They looked at the level of traffic stress, they looked at the adjacent land uses, but then they also looked at the populations living in those areas to make sure, because we have, you know, populations that are more likely to walk or bike every day. So that's another important thing to consider as well, is not only the, you know, the future population, but the current population that lives there, their demographics and their, you know, limitations from a transportation perspective, and really focus those key projects around those areas.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Then our next one is our climate change and resilience element.
We'll make room.
Yeah.
We're growing as we move down the agenda.
I can also leave after mine. We're the newest element and the most staffed.
I mean, I think it's really important on the transportation side that we're completing sidewalks, we're completing corridors too. And
Pasta. Yeah, I almost thought, I was like, how can I work this in?
Yeah, especially based on how much traffic is right there. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, good evening, Council. Lindsay Fields, Climate Sustainability Coordinator. It's great to see you all again. I feel like I make this joke every time, but it's not for an ILA this time, so be thankful. No, so we're going to be talking about the Lacey climate element, which in some ways is the newest elements to the comprehensive plan. Obviously, we had an environmental element the past 10 years, but there are a lot of new changes and mandates from the state in terms of the elements that we have to create and what we have to plan for. And then I would just like to mention that I have Ron Whitmore here with me and Robin Wong. They're from Ramey Associates. They're the consultants working on our climate resilience sub-element. I'll get into the different elements, but they'll be talking when their slides come up. So HB 1181 is just what you heard from the transportation side, the climate change planning bill that came through last year, which mandates that all jurisdictions per GMA requirements must plan 2 new sub-elements, a greenhouse gas reduction sub-element, and then also a climate resiliency sub-element. And so some of the goals around this this bill were to reduce sprawl, obviously that's a GMA requirement as well, encourage multimodal transportation, as you just heard, reduce vehicle miles traveled, so that transportation element again, as well as land use, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, retain open space and enhance those spaces. So we talked about that a little bit with with the land use maps and parks and where they're located, and then plan for climate resiliency. And so that's a specific requirement for hazard mitigation, but that has to do with climate hazards specifically. And so the climate element, per the mandate, the city will create 2 new elements, just like I said, the greenhouse gas reduction sub-element and then the climate resiliency sub-element. And these can really be thought of as adaptation versus mitigation. So the mitigation is going to be the greenhouse gas sub-element piece, reducing greenhouse gas. We have the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, which fortunately has laid a ton of groundwork for having to adopt a greenhouse gas sub-element. And then the adaptation side, which really talks about how we're going to adapt to a changing climate and to changing climate hazards. So really, it's twofold. We should be working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we should also be planning for a future that might look different than it has in the past in terms of climate hazards. And so requirement 1 of the greenhouse gas sub-element, which is the one that I'm working on currently, should result in reductions in overall greenhouse gas emissions generated by transportation and land use. Result in reductions in per capita vehicles miles traveled, so that the HB 1181, like you just heard, has a lot of mandates around multimodal transportation and reducing vehicle miles traveled in Lacey. And then prioritize reductions that benefit overburdened communities, and so that really talks to the climate resilience sub-element as well. So recognizing overburdened communities within Lacey. And typically when we talk about overburdened communities in this context, we're talking about the communities that typically feel climate change first. So lower income households that may not be able to update cooling mechanisms in their house or insulation to have better heating and cooling and things like that. And so one of the great things about this actually has been developing this interdepartmental climate team. So per the grant that we got through Commerce to do this work, one of the deliverables, one of the requirements is that we develop this interdepartmental team. And we've got to bring together folks from Public Works, the City Manager's Office, Veronica Hand, for our new Diversity and Equity Coordinator, CED, so like the housing folks, and Hans, me, Parks and Recreation, Facilities, and Emergency Management. Emergency Management is the big one, so Ed, who works on our hazard mitigation plan, to make sure those plans are talking to each other as well. And it's been really great because everything that we're putting together is now going through multiple eyes at different parts of the city. So it's really not just staying within community and economic development.
So when we talked about greenhouse gas emissions, and we saw the study and the report come through, and it was mainly buildings and structures. Yes. Right.
Yes.
And so that's our number 1 producer.
Yes.
And so are we talking about? I mean, how do we go about telling the people who have existing buildings, hey, you're putting out too much, and you're going to have to change? And are we? I mean, because oftentimes
some of it we don't have to.
Okay.
Some of the state's doing it for us, so we don't have to do that. So like the Clean Buildings Act is a large one for large commercial spaces in Washington State. They have to. And actually, we have a Tier 2 building within Lacey that we'll have to eventually get an energy audit on. So really, Clean Buildings Act is you have to have an energy audit done on your space, and then they sort of ramp up by the year the kind of energy efficiency things you have to put in place or pay fines or work out. But the great thing about that is Commerce is also offering rebates for commercial facilities to do that as well. So they're trying to put some money into it. So it's not just on the building owner to do that. In terms of energy efficiency, we really can't mandate, especially with the new initiative that just came out, anyone electrify their home. But what we can do is provide incentives and plan for that. And one of the things we can do through building code as well as new buildings and constructions, they're already, just based on the year that we're in, they're going to have higher standards for energy efficiency. But again, new buildings and constructions, we can kind of say, there's these building codes you have to follow. Yeah.
Touch on older buildings, I think
Yeah.
they're organically going to take care of themselves because essentially you're passing the cost on to your tenants.
Mhm.
And so that cost raises and it gets too high, they either leave or you invest back in your building, or you say you're on a bigger lot with a smaller building, then you expand that building to make the square footage more cost effective for everybody. You know, so if you don't, then you have an empty building.
Well, and obviously this is, what a lot of the data is showing is we have, especially on our older buildings that weren't built in the past 10 years, 15 years, that is what's taking up a lot of it. And so, I mean, obviously a strategy to help those buildings and those homes. I'm curious on, and this is something that we hear all the time, is in some ways these two things are at odds, especially when we're at, odds, especially when we're talking about, the most at-risk part of the housing side, where we need more affordable housing, but the more we put into the requirements, right, and now it's kind of gotten overboard, where the requirements will make it like this much better, but it costs 20 times as much. Like, so how are you trying to figure that part out? How do we keep affordable housing still affordable, and still meet these requirements? Because that's
Absolutely.
That's where the rubber meets the road there.
Yeah, fortunately, we have a housing coordinator on staff now as well, who is working on the housing element. And so she's sitting on the interdepartmental climate team. She also sits right behind me at work. So we're talking in the meeting. And so it really is, yes, there is a strain between having to be more efficient to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and also build affordable housing. The great thing, the way that things have come about now, though, is really instead of mandating, like offering incentives.
Yeah.
So because I know we have, and we've been looking at updating the multifamily tax exemption, those kind of things. And so having those things in place that say, like, it should be more inefficient, but also here's an incentive to do things. So I think, and especially with the residential side as well, like, we're not going to mandate our way out of this, but we're going to incentivize it, and we can do that because HERE funding, again, was reappropriated by the legislation. So we're going to have money, and through the Climate Commitment Act, to sort of incentivize folks to make those changes. And really, the cost of energy is increasing as well. Yeah. And so it is more energy efficient to update your house versus just continually paying these really high energy costs. So, yeah.
I keep hearing energy audit.
Yeah. Yes.
Everywhere I go, I seem to hear
Yeah.
this. For the most part, I don't know if we're talking about commercial or residential.
Both.
And then I don't know if we're talking about, are we talking about buyer and seller, or are we just talking about, are we talking about the potential of an energy audit before title transfers to another person? Would that be mandated?
Yeah, they're very different. Yeah, the Clean Buildings Act for commercial energy audit would be very different. It'd probably be a much more, so there's different standards too. So Department of Energy has a housing model to use for energy audits. I don't necessarily think or know that they have a commercial one. So so you're talking about two different things. So a commercial energy audit is through the Clean Buildings Act. I mean, it has to be done within the next 3 years, and that would dictate your projects then, that you have to make upgrades to your commercial. A housing energy audit, we do have a home energy score model ordinance that we worked on the past year. We talked about time of sale instead of time of transfer, so it doesn't slow down the cost of sale, but that isn't something that has been adopted by Lacey. It hasn't been adopted by any of the jurisdictions yet. But yes, there are different ways to go about it. Yeah, sorry.
What size buildings on the On the commercial buildings, what size building triggers that requirement?
There's different tiers, and I don't know them off the top of my head just because I haven't had to, there's nothing that I have to do or the city does. It's all through commerce.
Okay.
But I think there's tier 1, tier 2, and maybe tier 3 buildings. And tier 1 will be those really large ones. Tier 2 is, I don't know, like 50,000 square feet or something like that, I think. Yeah.
I do want to let you get through your slides.
But no worries.
On the deputy mayor's point, I've been curious about how we can provide incentives and support for owners of large multifamily residential buildings to transition from carbon-emitting fuel sources like natural gas to electric, because that's probably, as expensive as it is for a single-family occupied building, probably way more expensive for an aging apartment complex to transition. But that is, like Carolyn's got the screen up that shows our greenhouse gas inventory, and about half of it, there it is.
There it is.
About half of it is buildings. So
Yes.
we can't just look at future development. What are we doing to help existing development, probably the largest emitters, shift? And
Yeah.
like the HERE funding maybe is one of those options.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, yes, you're right. Large multifamily units are one of those things that don't typically fall into what we incentivize. So it's really between the state and us and other jurisdictions to come up with a plan to how to help those, transition to clean energy or more efficient heating sources. So this is the 2022 Thurston County Greenhouse Gas Inventory that we helped pay for and also conduct this through the Thurston Climate Mitigation Collaborative, our ILA that we signed last year. And so we're going to use this now to create our greenhouse gas sub-element at the city. Department of Commerce, very trickily put in some language later on that was talking about how we should be doing our own greenhouse gas inventory at the city level. And it may make sense later on in a couple of years to do that but we don't have to do that. And since we already did and paid for this one, the Thurston County one, we're going to use this for our sub-element. And so it really wouldn't change that much, if at all. Anyways, if we did our own at the city versus using the county one, buildings are going to be our largest greenhouse gas source, and that includes residential and commercial. But actually, when you break it down, residential, I think it goes transportation, residential energy use, and then commercial energy use. So a lot of the strategies and actions you'll see in the comprehensive plan will have to do with these two sectors.
Is clean energy strictly electricity?
There are some, yes. Some people think like dams are clean energy, but they still have a greenhouse gas emissions attached to them. And so clean energy is really the things that you're gonna, like solar, wind, things that don't typically generate emissions when you're producing energy. But yes, it's electricity. As you can see, and per globally, countrywide, and statewide, we are not on target to meet our goals in the TCMP, and really we're not on track to meet the goals that we'll need to meet for our comprehensive plan. And so that's really just about, we haven't really started implementation until last year of the plan, so we're hoping that this will, through implementing these strategies and actions in the plan, that we'll be able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's important to note that it's not just us that's not on track, it's everybody. Greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. So they're different than the TCMP goals. So we're mandated to be net zero by 2050. That includes, so 2050 net zero, we now have to work back and set goals along the way that we should be meeting to be net zero. And that includes, we could set a goal at 2030. I thought it might be more prudent, considering 2030 is 5 years away, that we set a goal for 2035 to be 45% below 2022 levels, so that greenhouse gas inventory that we just did, those levels. And that's a commerce guidance. You'll see the state is by 1990 levels, but commerce is using 2022 for cities. And then by 2040, we should be at 75% below 2022 levels. So we're kind of ramping up those goals as we get to net zero, and then net zero by 2050.
You have a question?
Yes.
Okay, so we are going the wrong way.
Yes.
And the first goal is 10 years away, and we're
Yes.
currently heading the wrong way, right?
Well, we have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, just not enough.
So what are the repercussions if we don't meet the goal for this mandate of 2050 achieving net zero? Is it financial, or is it just a goal that the legislator has set out for us?
Well, there's a couple ways I could answer that. If we don't meet our goals by 2050, then we're looking at a drastically different climate.
Yeah.
You have to remember, too, that Washington primarily is not getting hit the same way as other states in our country. So we're looking at now having to accommodate for climate refugees from other states, which, especially like California, some of the southern states, New Mexico, drought conditions. And so although there's not like a fine that we would hit by 2050, there are some repercussions of that.
Sure, that makes sense.
I can expand on that a little bit, and it's really nothing to do with what we're doing, but just technology-wise, the things that are coming down the pipeline, so everyone knows, because this is what I'm kind of a nerd about. The rise of AI is forcing the development of nuclear energy. So, for example, we have already approved our first nuclear reactor specifically for AI in America. China currently is building 26. So in competition, we are going to start building them. Generation 4 nuclear reactors are dramatically more efficient and safer. 96% of the energy they get out of it versus like 2% in Generation 3. On top of that, the expansion, fusion energy is expected to be within 2 decades. And that will just make this stuff non-existent. So what is important that we do right now is not make the number go backwards, because the technology, I guarantee you, is going to dramatically change so much moving forward. So don't laugh when like the 2050 comes up, because we're going to be there. And it is coming, and you're going to see it dramatically advance.
I would say it's probably sooner. I worked on the National Ignition Facility, and they've stabilized plasma, so it's cooking right along. Plus the competition worldwide, Europe, China's a bunch. It's going to move a lot faster.
Right. When we think about 2050, we're definitely thinking about the future, and not like what we have right now for standards for clean energy or efficiency. And so by 2050, we do expect that technology rises and changes to energy will be drastically different. That's also why we sort of ramp up those goals towards 2050, because we kind of accommodate for changes in technology and updates to EV charging or to EVs or things like that make it much more efficient. We also, 75% too, and I just want to make sure this is clear. This isn't just for this isn't for residents in our community. This is for the city itself. So the city has to be net zero by 2050. And right now we're planning to be, at least our fleet is planning to be electric by 2040. So I think I have confidence we will hit that goal by 2050, for sure.
I guess that this sort of reminds me, and it's something that I think we need to take into account. We know that electrical transmission of energy is going to become more and more important, and yet we still have transmission lines on poles in a Tree City, USA, right? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. When we know if we could underground it, it's be considerably more it's safer, and you're not sort of subject to Mother Nature as much.
Absolutely.
Is that something that like we're preparing for now, where we should be trying to underground transmission lines everywhere we can?
That would be something we'd have to talk to PSC about. But yes, I mean, it also might be something that we can talk about in our climate resilience sub-element when we talk about resilient, energy use into the future.
I mean, it seems like common sense to me.
Yeah, for sure. No, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. So these are the goals. These are some of the goals that we're going to have in our, or at least talk about and have the public come talk about with us tomorrow. The other one is like reducing vehicle miles traveled, which we already talked about. The great thing about the way that we're doing the comp plan this time is that as you go through the web page, hopefully there'll be icons or links that connect you to the other parts. So reducing vehicle miles traveled isn't just going to be in the climate element that you have to print off, 20 pages of. You can see it in the transportation plan. So we have a much more integrated plan, which is one of the great things about HB 1181 is that we're integrating a lot of these goals and policies together.
I can just go back and clarify the PSE comment. I think council's aware that we do have regulations that require underground power with new development or road projects, and there's an agreement in place with PSC on who shares that cost, who bears that cost, depending on the circumstances. But the challenge is, like I think you're talking to, is that proactive work, and that comes from, because PSC is basically a private entity regulated by the State Utility Trades Commission. They'd have to work through the Utility Trades Commission, and they would probably use a rate basis in order to make that work. But that's something that would be a conversation that could have, but it's really a conversation between PSC, the rate customers, and UTC in terms of how that is administered.
So you're saying on new constructions, we can mandate it, but we can't go back and force them to?
Retroactively, just proactively underground. It's triggered by that new construction and frontage improvements, and we have standards in our guidelines that say when existing power lines need to be undergrounded, and then who pays for it. It could be private development, it could be part of a city transport road project, and in those cases, there's a split in how that's paid for between PSC and the city.
I'd be interested to see, obviously, we know there's a large rate increase that just happened, it's going to happen again next year. I'd be interested to see if some of that was just the rising costs, or if that was because they're expecting to be due to a lot of this, like, upgrades to, so if there's any information we'd find out about that, I would really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I can look into it for you. I know that PSC has a lot of mandates by the state as well in terms of clean power that they have to meet by like 2035, I think. So I can look into it and I can send it to you. Absolutely. One thing I would like to note about the goal of 2050 is that things get more expensive the longer we wait, which is just generally true with technology as well. So you'll see a lot of the heavy emissions reductions fronted, hopefully also hedging off those costs later on that we would have to pay just by waiting it out. It is also true that technology becomes cheaper over time. So there's a little give and take in terms of how we pay for things.
Much of what we've talked about tonight in all of these different programs seems to me to be dependent on the obtaining of grant funding, large money that flows downhill. That seems to be coming to something of a halt. So what is the most important thing to put into the Growth Management Act where there is some reality of getting it accomplished? Because in the next, I would say 2 to 4 years, this money is going to dry up, and we're going to have to figure out as a city what to do with the money we have. And it's pretty limited.
I guess that's a good question. It's like, how much of this is financially constrained and how much isn't?
All of it. Technology versus financial, for sure.
Yeah, sure.
New infrastructure.
At least on the climate side, federally there's been a change in priorities, but the Climate Commitment Act will be around for the foreseeable future, which is actually paying and or supposed to pay for a lot of these climate initiatives that we have to do for grant money. In the state of Washington, yeah. In the state of Washington, yes. So where we're, yeah. I think absolutely.
I'm very nervous and very worried. The university just lost hundreds of millions of research money.
Yeah.
On which positions depend and your life may depend in the future. But we need to take a realistic look at the fact that funding is going to go away. That's what I've heard.
For sure.
And how are we going to deal with that?
You spoke before about trigger events. So for instance, when a homeowner sells their home, they would have to automatically have an energy audit done on the home, which is an expense. We've been talking a lot about affordable housing. With this affordable housing, now all of a sudden, that $100,000 home, in a dream world anyway, is now $136,000 because we have to upgrade the heat system, we have to upgrade the insulation factor, we have to get rid of that furnace. So when does this new trigger law come into effect?
There is no trigger law in effect right now. So, and what you're talking about is mandating energy efficient upgrades, and that's not what the home energy score is talking about. The home energy, it's a lot to get into when we're talking, it's a very specific policy and goal that's laid out in the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. It's something we've been working on in conjunction with the other jurisdictions. But it's not, when I talk about a trigger, it's specific to the fact that if in this model ordinance program, when you go to sell your home, you would need to have an energy audit attached to that home. You wouldn't need to make those upgrades, but there would be a need to, and really it's just an informational piece for buyers to know exactly what the home costs to run, what kind of equipment you have in there, and that's what that's specific to. But that's a very specific policy in a different program outside of, it's a very specific.
We don't know.
We don't know, but Portland is about $150.
We don't have energy auditors yet.
No. It would add about 10 new jobs, though, just saying. Okay.
And it hasn't come for us to vote on yet either.
Yeah, we haven't, there won't be anything on the agenda until later this year on any of that. Yeah, sorry.
That'll be a big
and so, sorry, just the last thing is step 3. So we're currently presenting the data results to the public, and then we'll get feedback from them and incorporate that into the thing, and then we'll have to integrate measures into plan and evaluate progress. We'll utilize our internal staff team to do that, and then also we'll set inventory update guidelines, so when we will actually have to do an update. And with that, I'm going to have to pass it off to the next section, the climate resiliency section. Sorry. I'm going to give you that.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good evening, City Council members, Planning Commissioners. Thank you for making time on your agenda for us this evening. We'll try to keep this really quick. My name is Ron Whitmore. I'm a principal with Raymond Associates. We're a planning firm that works across the Western region. I've been working in community sustainability for 30 years, half of that in planning, half in climate projects. And for Ramey, I manage a mix of comprehensive plan updates and climate planning plan projects. With me here tonight is Robin Wong, who's done much of the technical work for the project. We're both, as I mentioned, with Ramey, and we're a mission-driven firm that does a variety of planning-related work, including lots of climate adaptation, climate action plans, environmental justice work, and equity-focused planning. And it's our pleasure to work with Lindsay and Ryan and the rest of the climate team on the adaptation plan. At this point, I'll turn over to Robin to explain what the progress we've made so far, the types of input we're going to be inviting from the public tomorrow night, and then I'll wrap it up at the end and just say a little bit about when we'll next be talking with you about adaptation policies.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Ron. Good evening, council members and commissioners. As Ron mentioned, I'm Robin Wong, and I'm going to give a quick overview of the resilience sub-element, but feel free to jump in throughout with your questions or comments. So Lindsay gave a pretty good overview of both of our elements, but a little bit more about the resilience sub-element. This element recognizes that the impacts of climate change are already occurring and that they are projected to get worse over time. And, we talked about 2050, but, even if emissions were to stop today, the climate change would continue to progress, at least for decades to come. So the purpose of the resilience sub-element is to increase the ability of human communities, infrastructural assets, and ecological systems to avoid or reduce the impacts of those climate-related natural hazards, which include extreme heat, wildfire smoke, and severe storms, among others. And because climate change disproportionately harms populations that have social vulnerabilities and experience environmental inequities, a key priority for us is to address the impacts to those overburdened communities, and that's something that's required per the Commerce guidance as well. So this is our project scope. We're really focused on making a sub-element that's visionary but implementable. And so our first phase here was a robust technical analysis, and that was to understand the policies and the work that the city already does around climate. We also want to capitalize on the city's successes, make sure that everything is consistent across policies, and fill any gaps that exist today. And in this phase, we also conducted an assessment of the climate vulnerabilities and risks posed by climate hazards to people and assets in the city and the UGA. And so based on this analysis, we're currently in the policy development phase, where we're developing the framework of adaptation and resilience policies and goals, which really just make up the sub-element at the end of the day. And then after that, we put that all together into the comprehensive plan amendments. We'll also identify where in the city code those need to be amended so that everything aligns. And then, as you've heard today, there's a lot of comprehensive plan elements going at the same time. So we're working closely with city staff, MIG, and Fair and Pierce to align our engagement and our deliverables. So our schedule is a little bit different from the rest of the comp plan. We kicked off with everyone else in September of last year, and we did those foundational tasks, some preliminary engagement, and now we're in the policy frameworks. But the anticipated completion of our work on the resilience sub-element is expected to be in June 2025, and that's with the sub-element draft and the code audit. And then from there, the city will proceed with the comp plan amendments through the end of 2025. Okay, we'll go over a little bit of our work completed to date. So the plan and policy audit was part of the foundational analyses to develop our goals and policies. This gave us an understanding of the existing policy landscape through a review of 8 city plans and also partner agency plans, including the 2016 comp plan, the county's hazard mitigation plan, and Lacey's annex for that plan. And other ones related specifically to infrastructure and facilities like the Stormwater Comprehensive Plan and the Parks Plan. And through this analysis, we found that the city actually already has a lot of policies in these plans that can just be consolidated into the resilience sub-element, but supplemented with a little more clarity around climate resilience. And some areas that we intend to strengthen are policies about heat, wildfire smoke, as well as prioritizing measures that increase the resilience of vulnerable communities. So to develop our sub-element policies, we need to know what the impacts of climate change are going to be on Lacey's communities, infrastructure, and assets. So we conducted the assessment of the climate data from the University of Washington, which examines the climate impacts from the various hazards, including extreme heat events, extreme storms, wildfire. And generally, the city and the urban growth area have a low exposure to climate hazards compared to other counties or other cities and counties in Washington, as well as compared to other states in the country. However, that doesn't mean that we can just ignore the potential for these impacts to happen. So ones that we think are going to be important to keep in mind are extreme heat events, extreme storm and wind events, and wildfire smoke. We've also identified some social vulnerabilities and Lacey-specific built environment vulnerabilities to focus on throughout our policy development. Some key factors that increase residents' vulnerabilities to climate change include age, income, being a renter, and language access. An important built environment factor, which I think we've already heard about today, include, especially in the context of past heat dome events, include the lack of air conditioning in existing homes. And what we're doing right now is the policy framework, and this is a set of goals and policies for the resilience sub-element. We're taking what we learned from those 2 technical analyses as well as the community engagement that we've conducted already, and tomorrow's engagement, which is specifically about some of the draft goals and policies that just the draft goals that we've developed so far. I think Hans and Ryan and the team may have already gone through some of the engagement activities, but we do have some climate-specific findings and some engagement that we've conducted. For our own sub-element efforts, we've conducted listening sessions to hear from local residents and leaders to help us understand what people are experiencing related to climate change in their lives and their work. We anticipate having an ongoing dialogue with community members throughout this process, but we're actually done with this task for now. Some key findings are listed here, which are things we've heard throughout this evening, which include wanting to focus on heat and wildfire smoke, a focus on the impacts of power outages, just sort of in the everyday as well as during climate hazard events. Something interesting was there's sort of a lack of communication connecting public health impacts and those climate change hazards, like in the context of the heat dome. And then also pursuing nature-based solutions, which is focusing on reducing climate change impacts through ways that use the natural environment and improve ecosystem services. We also had some climate-specific questions in the survey that was part of the comprehensive plan overall survey, and what we heard was that people have experienced in the community warmer temperatures or heat waves, wildfires or wildfire smoke, as well as heavy rain events and flooding. We also asked residents what assets they thought were important to protect in the city from the impacts of climate change, and overwhelmingly the response was natural resources, including trees, open spaces, and lakes. Nearly everyone who answered the question chose natural resources over other options like homes, roads and bridges, and critical facilities, which is not totally surprising, especially since climate hazards are not really supposed to impact a lot of Lacey's facilities. But yeah, that was interesting to hear from the community. Okay, I'll pass it back to Ron.
I really just have to say that it's critical that we have direct conversations with policymakers in the city, and so we look forward to coming back to, I believe, is it a joint session or a series of meetings with Planning Commission and Council?
Yeah, it's not going to be a joint
Okay,
session,
all right.
but yeah.
Yeah, back in April. So as Robin mentioned, we've developed draft goals and policies. We'll be talking with the community tomorrow night about those goals, and in the middle of a discussion with city staff about the draft policies. But very much look forward to coming back and discussing with you directly those policies in April in anticipation of preparing the public draft plan by May, June time period. So with that, that's it for our presentation this evening. Happy to take any questions or comments you have at this point.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do we have any tracking or incentives for solar currently?
We do not have incentives currently to install solar, although we do promote and coordinate with Olympia Community Solar when they have their program, which is a group purchase program.
I would say one of the things that is a lot of the average everyday person who struggles to pay their energy or their light bill or their gas is with the increase in efficiency is not translated to a decrease in bill. And so for the average person, they don't care as much because they're not seeing a benefit. And so one thing I think would be important for our city to do, and I think every city, is to track and incentivize solar energy. The last probably 2 years has been some really extreme advancements in solar energy, not only efficiency, but the way they look. They actually look like roofing now. And I think it's something that we really don't talk about and leave out, and it's the only thing that's actually going to translate to that person getting a decrease in their energy bill. So.
Yeah, I can say as someone who put solar on my house 2 years ago, it's had a dramatic impact on my power bill during the summer. Y'all live here, you know what the winters are like, but during the summer, my power bill dropped to almost zero a couple of times during last year. And I don't even have like the full array because there's still trees around my house on my neighbor's property line. But it has been a benefit to me. And there are still federal tax incentives. So even though you pay up front for the solar, on the back end, when you file your taxes, a lot of times you'll get a credit for up to a third of the cost of the solar panels. So it's meaningful.
Yeah, I think it's just a discussion that we don't have enough, and at minimum, we should be tracking and figuring out some way to incentivize it like we were doing with, the heat pumps and different things like that.
And as Nick was saying, when I converted my home recently from a gas furnace to an electric heat pump, my energy bill went up, right? So luckily, it was a kind of forced, I needed to upgrade, but it would be nice to incentivize it in a way where people could see a reduction in their pricing versus incentivizing, I feel good, I help the environment, and I'm still paying more, right? So that's not a luxury that a lot of individuals have, and I was really fortunate to be able to do that, but that's not what most people can do.
Is the city still buying green energy?
Yes.
From PSC?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We also, there's two different things. Yes, we're a green power community, and also a while ago we bought into projects through PSC that we're now getting credit. So.
Our commitment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like a wind. And,
Yes. Our commitment for that was 5 years.
I would have to check. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, and
Maybe 10. Yeah.
We've had this discussion in the past. Does it make more sense? We're paying more for the green energy, right? But does it make more sense to take those dollars and actually put straight into solar projects within our community that have a return on that, an ongoing return on that investment, than just paying the higher dollars so PSC can meet their goals? I mean, it feels good on paper, but it's not change anything long term, and we could be investing those dollars into real projects that are saving our community.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I think just like Robin was kind of emphasizing, is when you actually get something like solar installed, it makes you actually see like, oh, I'm doing my part, and it makes you want to do other things. So it's actually engaging our community members to be more conscious about what they're doing. Whereas if they, we just buy energy and maybe that,
It's less of an active
Yeah.
thing. And the same thing happened to me, sorry. I did solar and it changed my bill. I switched from natural gas to electricity and my bill stayed the same. So one thing felt better from the bottom line perspective than the other.
One thing I would just like to add as council has this conversation is to think about group solar.
Yes.
And so not everyone can install solar on their house. But one thing we could do is, and I don't want to, I could talk about this for 10 hours. I don't want to derail the conversation more. We have, I think, another element, but is to have conversations around how we support group projects for solar. So someone buys into an array and then, and those type of projects.
And not just solar, but smart solar, right? Because they have systems out there that, you're always, the panels are always, gaining that, working, but they have generators and they have batteries that absorb it, and then you use the battery power when the peak hours that are 3 times the cost to everybody, early in the morning and then late at night when everybody gets home and using their stuff. So everything needs to be smart now.
So one thing, I just wanted to remind the council, we still have a ways to go. And we will be back April 1st. Lindsay will be in front of the council with an update on all the climate efforts. So the one thing I just want to check before we move on is we presented information. You got really into the weeds on some specifics, but we want to just touch base on the climate part, the climate element, the resiliency sub-element, and just kind of anything additional we should be taking away as a result before we leave this topic tonight.
I think we got into some specifics, but I do think we always should be thinking about what is the latest technology. Are we taking advantage of it? I think the whole discussion on solar compared to what we're doing right now on those, that's worth discussing. But Carolyn, do you?
I think we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah. One last thing. Can you give me an example? It says prioritize measures to increase the resilience of vulnerable communities. That sounds really good. Can you give me an example, a real life example of what that looks like, though?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard that there's some existing programs like, the heat pump installs that I think there's some targeted efforts to, get lower income residents to participate in. You can imagine there's things around that with air conditioning as well. Solar plus battery could be one way. There's also, renters, I think, are a segment of the population that falls probably into this category because of, less ability to do things to one's home. That probably lies more in like incentive programs for, I don't know, like portable ACs and that kind of thing. I know the heat dome was a big issue that people have brought up to us. So indoor heat, I think, is a big problem for that segment of the community, is what we've heard. And so I think a lot of incentive programs, there's ways to target them towards the people that need them most.
And also having cooling centers is another one, like, community spaces where people can go during certain times of the years, that's really important as well.
Okay, let's go on to the housing.
As we transition out.
Thank you, climate friends.
Just want to clarify on the council investment at PSC and the wind farms. Enter that agreement in November of 2020, and it's a 20-year agreement.
20-year.
Good God.
I'm on. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Ooh, that was a little close. Welcome, new commissioner. Good to see you here. And just a couple of things as we move into housing. First of all, tough acts to follow this evening. So I don't know if we're going to hit it out of the park with housing or if we're just going to feel depressed after this. But a couple of things maybe to think about as we continue to talk about housing. Some of this will be just kind of a refresher for things that we've talked about before, especially with Planning Commission, and some things this evening might be a little bit new, and we will continue to explore them together as we go. But a couple of things to maybe just simplify the process when you're thinking about housing. I've kind of liked to think of it as three increases and one decrease. So increasing density, increasing housing options and varieties, increasing flexibility for development and design, and then decreasing required parking. So those are hopefully some ways to think about the future of where the state would like to see us go with housing. So we'll just jump into this as best we can, and I'll try to give you your life back. And thank you so much, everyone, for being patient this evening. Okay, so just kind of a nice reminder, our current 2016 housing element it does summarize some values and objectives. Of course, these have been informed by our community and our community of stakeholders. These include things such as safe, affordable housing, housing that is thoughtfully planned for neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that are functional, appealing, well-located, and certainly that strengthen community connections. So let's go ahead and, again, with some review, we'll take a look at some data that helps inform us. And these are just, again, some good reminders. So as you are aware, our population is continuing to grow in Washington. Washington is expected to realize another 1.5 million residents in the next 20 years, increasing the housing demand by an expected 1.1 million additional units across all of our income bands. So a critical question really becomes, who are we planning for? And House Bill 1220 that I will speak to more just shortly identifies income groups that jurisdictions must plan for. This will include planning housing for emergency shelters all the way through moderate income bands. So a bit of a closer focus on low-income needs indicates that Lacey's share of housing needed to serve future populations between the 0 to 80% area median income is just under 10,000 units in our next planning cycle. Okay, so let's take let's look at current legislative mandates that Lacey must plan for and reflect in our housing element, and will also inform our development code. And then the question becomes, where are we going? So some key housing legislation includes House Bills 1220 that amends the Growth Management Act and requires that cities plan for housing at all income bands. In addition, cities must assess racially disparate impacts, displacement, and exclusion through policy analysis and make efforts to address these should they be found. House Bills 1110 House Bills 1110 and 2321 focus on the Middle Housing Initiative and require a citywide ordinance that incorporates development, zoning, and other regulations, for example, design specifications, that allow for a variety of housing types in neighborhoods where residential is the primary use. And then House Bill 1337 has new provisions for ADUs and increases the allowance of these units from the current 1 to 2 per lot in all urban growth areas. So thinking again about who are we planning for, the direction of House Bill 1220 mandates planning that accommodates all economic segments of the population. In addition, a directive is given that cities must identify sufficient land capacity to meet this goal. And I know that Hans did a great job this evening of thoroughly speaking to the land capacity. So just quickly we'll review, as Ryan Andrews did as well, recently briefed the City Council on the combined efforts across cities and in partnership with TRPC, who facilitated data analysis reflecting each jurisdiction's land capacity to support new housing units. And so some findings of the analysis indicated that no deficits are currently found in Lacey. This chart here, you can see the zone categories that are expected to support specific income populations and types of housing units that are likely to meet these needs, as well as a breakdown of units needed in each income band. So in a scenario where total unit capacity is met, Lacey would have a surplus of housing that exceeds the housing allocation projections. Okay, so this may be new to some of you. Concerning racially disparate impacts, House Bill 1220 further goes on to mandate that jurisdictions create policies to reduce housing displacement, support housing equity through investing in low to moderate income housing, and continue to identify areas at high risk for displacement that may result from zoning changes or development pressures. In addition, the city must also identify any patterns of disinvestment and then strategically plan to address those. So the cities of Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Yelm have contracted with a Seattle-based agency called Uncommon Bridges to produce a report specific to each area that addresses this mandate. Work is still in process, and planning staff is actively engaged with the agency to understand the findings of the final report. In addition, this process has included a substantial level of community and stakeholder engagement to assist there again with the understanding of our local concerns and our local needs, and then also identify what is working well in Lacey. Staff does anticipate seeing the final results of this report very soon and hopefully having this piece of our housing updates wrapped up by early March. So as mentioned, House Bills 1110 and 2321 provide requirements for the inclusion of middle housing. So Lacey is a Tier 2 city, which is based on population. There in the middle, you can see that would be a city that is at least 25,000 or above 25,000, but less than 75,000. And this requires that 2 middle housing units must be allowed on all lots when all other development regulations have been met. If at least one affordable unit is incorporated, that number can then be increased from a total of 2 units to a total of 4 units. So for example, where 4 dwelling units are proposed, this could be met by, say, 2 duplexes or maybe 1 fourplex. But keep in mind there again that one of those units must meet affordability requirements. So while Lacey already meets many of these requirements, we still have a little bit of work to do to determine the best path for implementing these new requirements.
Has anybody talked about how that might be enforced?
That would be part of an actual development standards update that will come outside of the comp plan process that Jennifer will bring forwards as well. So it would be code amendments.
Gotcha.
Thanks, Vanessa. Great. So I did want to highlight here that though the Middle Housing Initiative has been running adjacent to our housing element, I want to share that recently we did run a survey on all of our applicable social media sites to solicit feedback from our community. In addition, we did a mailer alerting residents to a survey opportunity, and we did try to target properties in Lacey where we feel are most suitable to take advantage of middle housing development. So for example, we sent a mailer to over 3,000 properties that were at least 10,000 square feet and that were within 200 feet of sewer. So the survey specifically was looking for input on which types of middle housing we should adopt through our ordinance. The state identifies 9 types that you've probably heard me speak about before. We do have to adopt 6 of those 9 types. The survey did yield close to a 10% response with about 350 replies. These will help inform our decision making as we move forward. Staff is currently analyzing the survey results, and we will be reporting later this month actually to the Planning Commission. So looking forward to doing that. And then taking a look at new provisions from House Bill 1337, which gives new guidance for accessory dwelling units. The city must now allow for 2 ADUs per lot in urban growth areas on any lots that meet the minimum lot requirements.
So the reason why a lot of our lots don't allow ADUs is because they're on septic systems and not sewer, right? So if you're in the UGA, it usually means it's because you're on a septic system. So they're going to allow 2 units and you're on a septic that's sized properly for your house and not 2 additional. How does that work? Does that make sense?
Yep. So I can help try to explain that. So we don't, in Lacey, we don't have a lot of properties that are on septic. I mean, we still have some, but not as much as the UGA. And really, the primary thing is you still have to meet the sanitary code. So Thurston County Environmental Health enforces a sanitary code that basically sizes your septic system to handle how many bedrooms are going to that system. That will preclude ADUs from being able to be installed on lots with septics in situations where septics aren't sized to handle them.
Oh,
Thank you for that.
yeah. I think there's no barrier to building an ADU on a certain lot unless there's like an environmental or like septic system limitation.
Correct.
So it wouldn't be us saying no just because we don't want more density, but if you can't have it because the sewer system isn't built for it, then you still can't build the ADU unless you have an adequate sewer system.
Yep.
Correct. Okay, so it's also important to note that with this bill, as well as the middle housing bill, the city will have some latitude as we establish specific development standards to satisfy this requirement and align with our community values and goals. So these ones might be a little bit new, but I did want to make sure to talk about these. Additional housing legislation includes regulations for a unit lot subdivision and also for something called co-living. So the unit lot subdivision provisions must be implemented along with the middle housing ordinance and the ADU updates, which for the city of Lacey will be due by June of 2026. So we've got a little time to continue working. However, the city must implement this new co-living bill by the end of this year, 2025. So we'll take a look at unit lot subdivisions here in the next slide, but a few things that I did want you to know about co-living. are that co-living housing is a type of residential development where individuals rent just a lockable sleeping unit while they share kitchen facilities with other residents in the building. So state law recognizes co-living under a lot of different names that you've probably heard. So some of these might include congregate living facilities, single room occupancy, rooming houses, boarding houses, lodging houses. So there's a lot of variety of names for things that we may already have some in our city. But I think what's very common across all of these varieties of names is that the units are commonly known to be micro units, which really is referring to their small individual floor area. So new legislation requires that co-living must be allowed on any lot within the urban growth area that allows at least 6 residential units, and that will be include our mixed-use zones as well. The legislation also sets standards for unit size, parking density, fees, and other development regulations. And then moving on to unit lot subdivisions, this is where we might see a little bit of shakeup, depending on if folks take advantage of this. So the unit lot subdivision allows the division of a parent lot into separately owned unit lots, or what we might consider child lots, while maintaining overall compliance with zoning standards. Unlike a traditional subdivision, a ULS applies zoning dimensional standards to the parent lot only, rather than to all of the individual lots. So this will allow for some greater flexibility in design. The unit lots, or again, the child lots, will be legally recognized, individually sellable, and assign their own parcel ID numbers for taxation and ownership purposes. Legislation requires cities to incorporate the ULS procedures into our short plat regulations. Key provisions of the law state that the parent lot must comply with the zoning requirements, but there again, individual unit lots are not required to conform to those standards. In addition, any portion of the parent lot not subdivided into individual unit lots must be owned in common by the unit lot owners or through a homeowners association. So looking to next steps on the housing front, as I was talking about, we'll be meeting with Planning Commission at the end of this month and go into more detail about our middle housing survey results. Staff is also working to develop goals and policies for our housing element. And then after that, we will, of course, be proceeding with developing draft language that will update our Lacey Municipal Code to include for things that we've talked about this evening, such as middle housing and ADU provisions. The housing element must also be informed by the racially disparate impacts report. And as I was talking about, that process is wrapping up and we'll have more information coming very soon about the results of that. And then just as one additional note, we did utilize a grant for the middle housing work. The grant funding or the terms of the grant run out about a year prior to when we will have to adopt an ordinance. So staff is working currently on draft language, that will be due in June to the Department of Commerce for a middle housing initiative. So I think that's all I had for you this evening, but of course, here for questions if you have them.
Well done getting through a lot of slides really fast.
Good job.
You're so welcome. Well, the alternative, I had one other plan. If you guys were asleep up here, I was just going to go with the bananas theory, which I've more recently learned about, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody.
Yeah. So I only have one question, and it's only because I was happening to look through this brochure that showed a mobile home, an actual mobile home, where you could put on a trailer, right? You could move it out, but it was a unit that, when you're looking at it, it had like everything. It was like a tiny home. You know, it had air conditioning, it had everything. But it was on wheels. But it was like the price of it was, I thought, very reasonable. And then I noticed it says it had the breakdown. If you bought 5 or more, you got a break. You bought 10 or more, you got another break. And I was just like going, wow, when's the last time we had a new mobile home park built? And because the old mobile home parks was the model for a lot of years on trying to meet the needs of those people who are very housing insecure, right? But these mobile homes have come so far from what those used to be. Is that actually allowed? Could you have a new mobile home unit where you could put 30 or 40 mobile of these units, connect them all to water, sewer, and it be allowed?
You get into some complex kind of legal definitions when we talk about some of those things. So the first is whether or not something is actually termed a manufactured home or not. And so manufactured home is something that has been certified for occupancy by HUD after 1976 or something like that. So
June.
72. Oh, that's close.
June 76.
So that's a manufactured home. Those are site placed. They are essentially anchored to the ground, and they are connected permanently to water and sewer and electricity. Something that is on wheels that you pull onto a site technically is not under that same definition, and so that's essentially like a trailer or an RV. And so those aren't allowed other than in RV parks. So we would not issue permits for them. So while manufactured home parks are allowed in any residential zone in Lacey, and the last one that was constructed, I think, was the one on 37th Avenue, kind of west of Camacha Middle School. They're not as maybe as popular as they used to be. I don't think we have as much available land, which has a lot to do with that. But stay tuned. I think one of the things that the legislature is looking at, something that we've been following, is actually the legislature is basically saying that if you own a lot that you have somebody in a trailer, you're allowed to do that, and the city can't preclude you from removing that or from having that trailer on your lot. So the city can't actually come in and tell you to move it. So you could actually have a trailer for occupancy in your driveway. Right now, I think in Lacey, the regulations are you're allowed to have it for 4 hours in front of your house. So we would have to look at changing our regulations.
But that doesn't.
The legend has that in front of them now. They're looking at that.
Right.
But that doesn't. But you couldn't set up a new park like what I'm just talking about, where you can.
You could if it meets the definition of a manufactured home.
But that.
It would have to be an RV park.
Or you have to do an RV park, which is a different land use classification.
Yeah, because man homes have to have runners and tie downs, right? Or to be considered a manufactured home. It has to have runners and tie
correct.
downs.
So, so you have the definition between, real property and personal
attached,
property.
Fixed.
Right. So personal property is like a vehicle.
Well, that's why I was just thinking, it's like, we sort of need more sort of outside the box thinking like that, where you could, that is affordable housing. They own real property. What they just need is a hookup, right? A place to put them, and they're attractive, and they have all the modern amenities, and you could get one for $60,000. All you just need is a hook.
Yeah. Like a boat, rent a slip.
Right? Like sign me up. Like I could put 30 of those on a lot, right?
Yeah, I think we'll be, our planning and housing team, we'll be keeping our eye on the city of Bellingham, who is considering doing some code updates to accommodate what you're talking about this evening. So people are talking about it, certainly.
I was wondering, we talked a year or two ago about Tumwater updating, like creating a specific code for manufactured home parks, because there have been issues, like that's a very vulnerable group of folks. Is that on our list? I don't want to add work. I know we don't want to add more stuff to what we're doing with this comp plan update, but if that's in the mix, that would be good to know.
Yeah, so at a high level, it's certainly in the mix. So while we're probably not through this process going to be able to, do a zoning change to those areas, it's something that we, through our, housing policy analysis, through the racially disparate impacts analysis, where we will have goals and policies that will be addressing those types of uses. The thing is with the manufactured home park issue is that once you start pulling at a thread, it's a really difficult thing to try to solve. And so, we need to be very strategic about what those future actions are. That's probably a well-deserved future work program item for sometime in 2026 at this point. But it's certainly on our radar screen. We've gotten a lot of community feedback. We've got a lot of concerned park residents that have reached out. It's super important to us to address it. We'll be doing that through goals and policies initially and following up with future work programs.
There's a reaction.
But
I grew up in San Francisco, and by not code, they packed them in. So there were constantly stories of mass fires killing, one house fire kills 32 people. What?
Yeah.
So with the new state mandates that said that we have to allow that, how do we simply keep that as on a proper scale?
But I guess it's always the question, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know that there's one answer, panacea to solve all of these
Although
issues.
the one thing that we can do is on any code update, we allow 6,000 units on array. Like, it's really up to the market to try to redevelop it. And none of this stuff happens overnight. And that's what we've seen. We have the most progressive ADU program, and we have in the state for years and years and years. And we still haven't seen ADUs everywhere. I mean, it's just like, yeah. So,
Well, I can tell you why.
32 of them.
I just had a quote for a customer for an ADU. The water and sewer hookup alone was $64,000.
Yeah. No, I know that's another thing we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So one thing that I really liked about the transportation that we had is that Lacey is kind of this hodgepodge of different communities that look a lot different. And so hopefully with that, it kind of makes it like, what does it look like to live in Lacey? And so my question regarding the housing is like, I love having the options and we need options, but how do we balance that without having Lacey in general, even just one neighborhood, having 10 different configurations of housing, which undoubtedly will affect, home prices? And is there a way to kind of manage that at all? Or will it just kind of be free for all where everybody can just, this house does 6 cottages and this house does 3 triplex, or, how do we balance that?
Yeah, so I mean, there will be, and I think getting back to what my comments were about some of the big changes about our land use and saying, okay, now that we're requiring, the state's basically saying you can do a 4-plex with 2 ADUs associated with it, that could really change the neighborhood character, right? And so, it's up to us to write, really clear code to make sure that those things are compatible with that existing neighborhood, character, so that we're not, privacy issues are addressed, that we have a proper separation between buildings and open spaces for people and those kinds of things. So, stay tuned. We're not that far down the road yet, but part of it, we're mandated to do these things now. How do we get them right? I think that's a little bit of the devil's in the details there.
And I think the other thing to think about that's super important about all these mandates is that as we kind of pull up a little bit out of that and we think about our comprehensive plan, we're going to have to be reviewing our goals and policies to ensure that they don't create conflict with these other rules that we're obligated to adopt. So as we move forwards and we start to talk specifically with you all about each element, we have talked internally about identifying those goals and policies that really are in there out of mandate versus out of community choice. And so as we start to get into the weeds on some of these things, there may be some goals and policies that we have to advance as a community because we've been told we have to. So we're going to try our best in some sort of way to signal that in the document as we go through that. This one's a mandate. This one we have some flexibility with. And that's where we'll be able to draw some connections between these mandates in terms of middle housing and unit lot subdivisions and ADUs and other flexible policies that we've adopted pursuant to public engagement and what we've heard here today and from our Planning Commission.
Okay. Is everyone else tired as I am?
Thanks for sticking around, Planning Commission. Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, actually, 2 seconds, and this is just for the council. One of the things that we talked about at our retreat was being able to meet on a more informal basis, maybe once a quarter. We haven't figured that out. What does that look like? Share dinner. What? And so I've talked to our city manager because we didn't come to a conclusion there. Everyone seemed interested, but we didn't come to yeah. So I said, Rick, what does this look like? So Rick, what does this look like?
Well, so we've been doing some checking and research because one of the things we want to do is make sure we're meeting the spirit as well as the intent of the OPMA, the Open Public Meeting Act. So there are some examples out there in the state, and one of the things we can look at is having a dinner, this informational meeting set up where we'd have a dinner before the night of a council meeting. Depending on what the council wants to do that in terms of a schedule or frequency, it would be advertised and open as a public meeting where people can physically attend. You wouldn't have to necessarily video record or broadcast. It'd just be a general in-person public meeting, and it'd be advertised as that, and anybody who'd want to observe can come and observe. And that'd be an opportunity for the council to sit, have dinner, and then potentially bring up topics that they want to talk about with the idea that there'd be no decisions at that time of conversation. What it would require if you want to do something like this is that we would need to change the council's policies and procedures to include that type of meeting and type of the structure and what it kind of looks like. And I can bring something back at the next work session on the 25th for council to take a look at and kind of talk about schedules. Just as an example, our neighbors to the west, City of Olympia, they have started this last September, and they typically have it monthly prior to their first regular council meeting of the month. So their case, that's the second Tuesday. If we did the same thing, it'd be our first Tuesday. So if that's something the council would like to consider, I can bring something back to flesh that out on the 25th.
Yeah, can you please bring that back and what that would look like and how we'd have to change our current policies and procedures so we could take action on it at a future meeting?
Okay.
Okay. We've now reached the end of our agenda. Thank you, everyone. So without objection, I'm going to call this meeting adjourned at 8:55 p.m. Keep it classy, Lacey.
This is like old school plans.